Chapter 19. Behind them Korak emerged from the jungle and recovered his spear from Numa's side. He still was smiling. He had enjoyed the spectacle exceedingly. There was one thing that troubled him, the agility with which the she had clambered from her pony's back into the safety of the tree above her. That was more like Mangani, more like his lost Mariam. He sighed. His lost Mariam. His little, dead Mariam. He wondered if this she-stranger resembled his Mariam in other ways. A great longing to see her overwhelmed him. He looked after the three figures moving steadily across the plain. He wondered where might lie their destination. A desire to follow them came over him, but he only stood there watching until they had disappeared in the distance. The sight of the civilized girl and the dapper, khaki-clad Englishman had aroused in Korak memories long dormant. Once he had dreamed of returning to the world of such as these, but with the death of Mariam hope and ambition seemed to have deserted him. He cared now only to pass the remainder of his life in solitude, as far from man as possible. With a sigh he turned slowly back into the jungle. Tanta, nervous by nature, had been far from reassured by close proximity to the three strange whites, and with the report of Hansen's rifle had turned and ambled away at his long, swinging shuffle. He was nowhere in sight when Korak returned to look for him. The ape-man, however, was little concerned by the absence of his friend. Tanta had a habit of wandering off unexpectedly. For a month they might not see one another, for Korak seldom took the trouble to follow the great pachyderm, nor did he upon this occasion. Instead he found a comfortable perch in a large tree and was soon asleep. At the bungalow Bwana had met the returning adventurers on the veranda. In a moment of wakefulness he had heard the report of Hansen's rifle far out across the plain, and wondered what it might mean. Presently it had occurred to him that the man whom he considered in the light of a guest might have met with an accident on his way back to camp, so he had arisen and gone to his foreman's quarters where he had learned that Hansen had been there earlier in the evening but had departed several hours before. Returning from the foreman's quarters Bwana had noticed that the corral gate was open and further investigation revealed the fact that Mariam's pony was gone and also the one most often used by Baines. Instantly Bwana assumed that the shot had been fired by Honorable Morrison, and had again aroused his foreman and was making preparations to set forth in investigation when he had seen the party approaching across the plain. Explanation on the part of the Englishman met a rather chilly reception from his host. Mariam was silent. She saw that Bwana was angry with her. It was the first time and she was heartbroken. "Go to your room, Mariam," he said, "and Baines, if you will step into my study, I'd like to have a word with you in a moment." He stepped toward Hansen as the others turned to obey him. There was something about Bwana even in his gentlest moods that commanded instant obedience. "How did you happen to be with them, Hansen?" he asked. "I'd been sitting in the garden," replied the trader, "after leaving Jarvis' quarters. I have a habit of doing that, as your lady probably knows. Tonight I fell asleep behind a bush, and was awakened by them two spooning. I couldn't hear what they said, but presently Baines brings two ponies and they ride off. I didn't like to interfere for it wasn't any of my business, but I knew they hadn't ought to be riding about that time of night, leastways not the girl, it wasn't right and it wasn't safe. So I follows them and it's just as well I did. Baines was getting away from the lion as fast as he could, leaving the girl to take care of herself, when I got a lucky shot into the beast's shoulder that fixed him." Hansen paused. Both men were silent for a time. Presently the trader coughed in an embarrassed manner as though there was something on his mind he felt in duty bound to say, but hated to. "What is it, Hansen?" asked Bwana. "You are about to say something, weren't you?" "Well, you see it's like this," ventured Hansen. "Being around here evenings a good deal I've seen them two together a lot, and, begging your pardon, sir, but I don't think Mr. Baines means the girl any good. I've overheard enough to make me think he's trying to get her to run off with him." Hansen, to fit his own ends, hit nearer the truth than he knew. He was afraid that Baines would interfere with his own plans, and he had hit upon a scheme to both utilize the young Englishman and get rid of him at the same time. "And I thought," continued the trader, "that inasmuch as I'm about due to move, you might like to suggest to Mr. Baines that he go with me. I'd be willing to take him north to the caravan trails as a favor to you, sir." Bwana stood in deep thought for a moment. Presently he looked up. "Of course, Hanson, Mr. Baines is my guest," he said, a grim twinkle in his eye. "Really, I cannot accuse him of planning to run away with Miriam on the evidence that we have, and as he is my guest I should hate to be so discourteous as to ask him to leave. But, if I recall his words correctly, it seems to me that he has spoken of returning home, and I am sure that nothing would delight him more than going north with you. You say you start tomorrow? I think Mr. Baines will accompany you. Drop over in the morning, if you please, and now good night, and thank you for keeping a watchful eye on Miriam." Hanson hid a grin as he turned and sought his saddle. Bwana stepped from the veranda to his study, where he found the Honourable Morrison pacing back and forth, evidently very ill at ease. "Baines," said Bwana, coming directly to the point, "Hanson is leaving for the north tomorrow. He has taken a great fancy to you, and just asked me to say to you that he'd be glad to have you accompany him. Good night, Baines." At Bwana's suggestion, Miriam kept to her room the following morning until after the Honourable Morrison Baines had departed. Hanson had come for him early. In fact, he had remained all night with the foreman, Jarvis, that they might get an early start. The farewell exchanges between the Honourable Morrison and his host were of the most formal type, and when at last the guest rode away, Bwana breathed a sigh of relief. It had been an unpleasant duty and he was glad that it was over, but he did not regret his action. He had not been blind to Baines' infatuation for Miriam, and knowing the young man's pride in caste, he had never for a moment believed that his guest would offer his name to this nameless Arab girl, for, extremely light in color though she was for a full-blood Arab, Bwana believed her to be such. He did not mention the subject again to Miriam, and in this he made a mistake, for the young girl, while realizing the debt of gratitude she owed Bwana and my dear, was both proud and sensitive, so that Bwana's action in sending Baines away and giving her no opportunity to explain or defend hurt and mortified her. Also, it did much toward making a martyr of Baines in her eyes and arousing in her breast a keen feeling of loyalty toward him. What she had half mistaken for love before, she now wholly mistook for love. Bwana and my dear might have told her much of the social barriers that they only too well knew Baines must feel existed between Miriam and himself, but they hesitated to wound her. It would have been better had they inflicted this lesser sorrow, and saved the child the misery that was to follow because of her ignorance. As Hanson and Baines rode toward the former's camp, the Englishman maintained a morose silence. The other was attempting to formulate an opening that would lead naturally to the proposition he had in mind. He rode a neck behind his companion, grinning as he noted the sullen scowl upon the other's patrician face. "Rather rough on you, wasn't he?" he ventured at last, jerking his head back in the direction of the bungalow as Baines turned his eyes upon him at the remark. "He thinks a lot of the girl," continued Hanson, "and don't want nobody to marry her and take her away, but it looks to me as though he was doing her more harm than good in sending you away. She ought to marry sometime, and she couldn't do better than a fine young gentleman like you." Baines, who had at first felt inclined to take offense at the mention of his private affairs by this common fellow, was mollified by Hanson's final remark, and immediately commenced to see in him a man of fine discrimination. "He's a darned bounder," grumbled the Honourable Morrison, "but I'll get even with him. He may be the whole thing in Central Africa, but I'm as big as he is in London, and he'll find it out when he comes home." "If I was you," said Hanson, "I wouldn't let any man keep me from getting the girl I want. Between you and me, I ain't got no use for him either, and if I can help you anyway, just call on me." "It's mighty good of you, Hanson," replied Baines, warming up a bit, "but what can a fellow do here in this God-forsaken hole?" "I know what I'd do," said Hanson. "I'd take the girl along with me. If she loves you she'll go, all right. It can't be done, said Baines. He bosses this whole blooming country for miles around. He'd be sure to catch us. No, he wouldn't, not with me running things, said Hansen. I've been trading and hunting here for 10 years and I know as much about the country as he does. If you want to take the girl along I'll help you, and I'll guarantee that there won't nobody catch up with us before we reach the coast. I'll tell you what, you write her a note and I'll get it to her by my head man. Ask her to meet you to say goodbye, she won't refuse that. In the meantime we can be moving camp a little further north all the time and you can make arrangements with her to be all ready on a certain night. Tell her I'll meet her then while you wait for us in camp. That'll be better for I know the country well and can cover it quicker than you. You can take care of the safari and be moving along slow toward the north and the girl and I'll catch up to you. But suppose she won't come, suggested Baines. Then make another date for a last goodbye, said Hansen, and instead of you I'll be there and I'll bring her along anyway. She'll have to come, and after it's all over she won't feel so bad about it, especially after living with you for 2 months while we're marking the coast. A shocked and angry protest rose to Baines' lips, but he did not utter it, for almost simultaneously came the realization that this was practically the same thing he had been planning upon himself. It had sounded brutal and criminal from the lips of the rough trader, but nevertheless the young Englishman saw that with Hansen's help and his knowledge of African travel the possibilities of success would be much greater than as though the Honourable Morrison were to attempt the thing single-handed. And so he nodded a glum assent. The balance of the long ride to Hansen's northerly camp was made in silence, for both men were occupied with their own thoughts, most of which were far from being either complimentary or loyal to the other. As they rode through the wood the sounds of their careless passage came to the ears of another jungle wayfarer. The killer had determined to come back to the place where he had seen the white girl who took to the trees with the ability of long habitude. There was a compelling something in the recollection of her that drew him irresistibly toward her. He wished to see her by the light of day, to see her features, to see the color of her eyes and hair. It seemed to him that she must bear a strong resemblance to his lost Miriam, and yet he knew that the chances were that she did not. The fleeting glimpse that he had had of her in the moonlight as she swung from the back of her plunging pony into the branches of the tree above her had shown him a girl of about the same height as his Miriam, but of a more rounded and developed femininity. Now he was moving lazily back in the direction of the spot where he had seen the girl when the sounds of the approaching horseman came to his sharp ears. He moved stealthily through the branches until he came within sight of the riders. The younger man he instantly recognized as the same he had seen with his arms about the girl in the moonlit glade just the instant before Numa charged. The other he did not recognize, though there was a familiarity about his carriage and figure that puzzled Korak. The ape-man decided that to find the girl again he would but have to keep in touch with the young Englishman, and so he fell in behind the pair, following them to Hansen's camp. Here the Honourable Morrison penned a brief note, which Hansen gave into the keeping of one of his boys who started off forthwith toward the south. Korak remained in the vicinity of the camp, keeping a careful watch upon the Englishman. He had half expected to find the girl at the destination of the 2 riders and had been disappointed when no sign of her materialized about the camp. Baines was restless, pacing back and forth beneath the trees when he should have been resting against the forced marches of the coming flight. Hansen lay in his hammock and smoked. They spoke but little. Korak lay stretched upon a branch among the dense foliage above them. Thus passed the balance of the afternoon. Korak became hungry and thirsty. He doubted that either of the men would leave camp now before morning, so he withdrew, but toward the south, for there it seemed most likely the girl still was. In the garden beside the bungalow Miriam wandered thoughtfully in the moonlight. She still smarted from Bwana's, to her, unjust treatment of the Honourable Morrison Baines. Nothing had been explained to her, for both Bwana and my dear had wished to spare her the mortification and sorrow of the true explanation of Baines' proposal. They knew, as Miriam did not, that the man had no intention of marrying her, else he would have come directly to Bwana, knowing full well that no objection would be interposed if Miriam really cared for him. Miriam loved them both and was grateful to them for all that they had done for her, but deep in her little heart surged the savage love of liberty that her years of untrammeled freedom in the jungle had made part and parcel of her being. Now, for the first time since she had come to them, Miriam felt like a prisoner in the bungalow of Bwana and my dear. Like a caged tigress, the girl paced the length of the enclosure. Once she paused near the outer fence, her head upon one side, listening. What was it she had heard? The pad of naked human feet just beyond the garden. She listened for a moment. The sound was not repeated. Then she resumed her restless walking. Down to the opposite end of the garden she passed, turned and retraced her steps toward the upper end. Upon the sward near the bushes that hid the fence, full in the glare of the moonlight, lay a white envelope that had not been there when she had turned almost upon the very spot a moment before. Miriam stopped short in her tracks, listening again, and sniffing more than ever the tigress, alert, ready. Beyond the bushes a naked black runner squatted, peering through the foliage. He saw her take a step closer to the letter. She had seen it. He rose quietly and following the shadows of the bushes that ran down to the corral was soon gone from sight. Miriam's trained ears heard his every move. She made no attempt to seek closer knowledge of his identity. Already she had guessed that he was a messenger from the Honorable Morrison. She stooped and picked up the envelope. Tearing it open, she easily read the contents by the moon's brilliant light. It was, as she had guessed, from Baines. I cannot go without seeing you again, it read. Come to the clearing early tomorrow morning and say goodbye to me. Come alone. There was a little more words that made her heart beat faster and a happy flush mount her cheek. Chapter 20. It was still dark when the Honourable Morrison Baines set forth for the trysting place. He insisted upon having a guide, saying that he was not sure that he could find his way back to the little clearing. As a matter of fact, the thought of that lonely ride through the darkness before the sun rose had been too much for his courage, and he craved company. A black, therefore, preceded him on foot. Behind and above him came Korak, whom the noise in the camp had awakened. It was 9 o'clock before Baines drew rein in the clearing. Miriam had not yet arrived. The black laid down to rest. Baines lolled in his saddle. Korak stretched himself comfortably upon a lofty limb, where he could watch those beneath him without being seen. An hour passed. Baines gave evidence of nervousness. Korak had already guessed that the young Englishman had come here to meet another, nor was he at all in doubt as to the identity of that other. The killer was perfectly satisfied that he was soon again to see the nimble she who had so forcefully reminded him of Miriam. Presently the sound of an approaching horse came to Korak's ears. She was coming. She had almost reached the clearing before Baines became aware of her presence, and then as he looked up, the foliage parted to the head and shoulders of her mount and Miriam rode into view. Baines spurred to meet her. Korak looked searchingly down upon her, mentally anathematizing the broad-brimmed hat that hid her features from his eyes. She was abreast the Englishman now. Korak saw the man take both her hands and draw her close to his breast. He saw the man's face concealed for a moment beneath the same broad brim that hid the girl's. He could imagine their lips meeting, and a twinge of sorrow and sweet recollection combined to close his eyes for an instant in that involuntary muscular act with which we attempt to shut out from the mind's eye harrowing reflections. When he looked again, they had drawn apart and were conversing earnestly. Korak could see the man urging something. It was equally evident that the girl was holding back. There were many of her gestures, and the way in which she tossed her head up and to the right, tilting her chin, that reminded Korak still more strongly of Miriam. And then the conversation was over and the man took the girl in his arms again to kiss her goodbye. She turned and rode toward the point from which she had come. The man sat on his horse watching her. At the edge of the jungle she turned to wave him a final farewell. "Tonight," she cried, throwing back her head as she called the words to him across the little distance which separated them, throwing back her head and revealing her face for the first time to the eyes of the killer in the tree above. Korak started as though pierced through the heart with an arrow. He trembled and shook like a leaf. He closed his eyes, pressing his palms across them, and then he opened them again and looked, but the girl was gone. Only the waving foliage of the jungle's rim marked where she had disappeared. It was impossible. It could not be true. And yet, with his own eyes he had seen his Mariam older a little, with figure more rounded by nearer maturity, and subtly changed in other ways, more beautiful than ever, yet still his little Mariam. Yes, he had seen the dead alive again, he had seen his Mariam in the flesh. She lived. She had not died. He had seen her, he had seen his Mariam in the arms of another man. And that man sat below him now, within easy reach. Korak, the killer, fondled his heavy spear. He played with the grass rope dangling from his G-string. He stroked the hunting knife at his hip. And the man beneath him called to his drowsy guide, bent the rein to his pony's neck and moved off toward the north. Still sat Korak, the killer, alone among the trees. Now his hands hung idly at his sides. His weapons and what he had intended were forgotten for the moment. Korak was thinking. He had noted that subtle change in Mariam. When last he had seen her she had been his little, half-naked Mangani, wild, savage, and uncouth. She had not seemed uncouth to him then, but now, in the change that had come over her, he knew that such she had been, yet no more uncouth than he, and he was still uncouth. In her had taken place the change. In her he had just seen a sweet and lovely flower of refinement and civilization, and he shuddered as he recalled the fate that he himself had planned for her, to be the mate of an ape-man, his mate, in the savage jungle. Then he had seen no wrong in it, for he had loved her, and the way he had planned had been the way of the jungle which they two had chosen as their home. But now, after having seen the Mariam of civilized attire, he realized the hideousness of his once cherished plan, and he thanked God that chance and the blacks of Kovudu had thwarted him. Yet he still loved her, and jealousy seared his soul as he recalled the sight of her in the arms of the dapper young Englishman. What were his intentions toward her? Did he really love her? How could one not love her? And she loved him, of that Korak had had ample proof. Had she not loved him she would not have accepted his kisses. His Mariam loved another. For a long time he let that awful truth sink deep, and from it he tried to reason out his future plan of action. In his heart was a great desire to follow the man and slay him, but ever there rose in his consciousness the thought, she loves him. Could he slay the creature Mariam loved? Sadly he shook his head. No, he could not. Then came a partial decision to follow Mariam and speak with her. He half started, and then glanced down at his nakedness and was ashamed. He, the son of a British peer, had thus thrown away his life, had thus degraded himself to the level of a beast that he was ashamed to go to the woman he loved and lay his love at her feet. He was ashamed to go to the little Arab maid who had been his jungle playmate, for what had he to offer her? For years circumstances had prevented a return to his father and mother, and at last pride had stepped in and expunged from his mind the last vestige of any intention to return. In a spirit of boyish adventure he had cast his lot with the jungle ape. The killing of the crook in the coastin had filled his childish mind with terror of the law, and driven him deeper into the wilds. The rebuffs that he had met at the hands of men, both black and white, had had their effect upon his mind while yet it was in a formative state, and easily influenced. He had come to believe that the hand of man was against him, and then he had found in Mariam the only human association he required or craved. When she had been snatched from him his sorrow had been so deep that the thought of ever mingling again with human beings grew still more unutterably distasteful. Finally and for all time, he thought, the die was cast. Of his own volition he had become a beast he had lived, a beast he would die. Now that it was too late, he regretted it. For now Miriam, still living, had been revealed to him in a guise of progress and advancement that had carried her completely out of his life. Death itself could not have further removed her from him. In her new world she loved a man of her own kind. And Korak knew that it was right. She was not for him, not for the naked, savage ape. No, she was not for him, but he still was hers. If he could not have her and happiness, he would at least do all that lay in his power to assure happiness to her. He would follow the young Englishman. In the first place he would know that he meant Miriam no harm, and after that, though jealousy wrenched his heart, he would watch over the man Miriam loved, for Miriam's sake, but God help that man if he thought to wrong her. Slowly he aroused himself. He stood erect and stretched his great frame, the muscles of his arms gliding sinuously beneath his tanned skin as he bent his clenched fists behind his head. A movement on the ground beneath caught his eye. An antelope was entering the clearing. Immediately Korak became aware that he was empty again. He was a beast. For a moment love had lifted him to sublime heights of honor and renunciation. The antelope was crossing the clearing. Korak dropped to the ground upon the opposite side of the tree, and so lightly that not even the sensitive ears of the antelope apprehended his presence. He uncoiled his grass rope. It was the latest addition to his armament, yet he was proficient with it. Often he traveled with nothing more than his knife and his rope. They were light and easy to carry. His spear and bow and arrows were cumbersome, and he usually kept one or all of them hidden away in a private cache. Now he held a single coil of the long rope in his right hand, and the balance in his left. The antelope was but a few paces from him. Silently Korak leaped from his hiding place, swinging the rope free from the entangling shrubbery. The antelope sprang away almost instantly, but instantly, too, the coiled rope, with its sliding noose, flew through the air above him. With unerring precision it settled about the creature's neck. There was a quick wrist movement of the thrower, the noose tightened. The killer braced himself with the rope across his hip, and as the antelope tautened the singing strands in a last frantic bound for liberty, he was thrown over upon his back. Then, instead of approaching the fallen animal as a roper of the western plains might do, Korak dragged his captive to himself, pulling him in hand over hand, and when he was within reach leaping upon him even as Shieta the panther might have done, and burying his teeth in the animal's neck while he found its heart with the point of his hunting knife. Recoiling his rope, he cut a few generous strips from his kill and took to the trees again, where he ate in peace. Later he swung off in the direction of a nearby water hole, and then he slept. In his mind, of course, was the suggestion of another meeting between Miriam and the young Englishman that had been borne to him by the girl's parting, tonight. He had not followed Miriam because he knew from the direction from which she had come and in which she returned that wheresoever she had found an asylum it lay out across the plains, and not wishing to be discovered by the girl he had not cared to venture into the open after her. It would do as well to keep in touch with the young man, and that was precisely what he intended doing. To you or me the possibility of locating the Honourable Morrison in the jungle after having permitted him to get such a considerable start might have seemed remote, but to Korak it was not at all so. He guessed that the white man would return to his camp, but should he have done otherwise it would be a simple matter to the killer to trail a mounted man accompanied by another on foot. Days might pass and still such a spoor would be sufficiently plain to lead Korak unfalteringly to its end, while a matter of a few hours only left it as clear to him as though the makers themselves were still in plain sight. And so it came that a few minutes after the Honourable Morrison Baines entered the camp to be greeted by Hansen, Korak slipped noiselessly into a nearby tree. There he lay until late afternoon, and still the young Englishman made no move to leave camp. Korak wondered if Miriam were coming there. A little later Hansen and one of his black boys rode out of camp. Korak merely noted the fact. He was not particularly interested in what any other member of the company than the young Englishman did. Darkness came and still the young man remained. He ate his evening meal, afterwards smoking numerous cigarettes. Presently he began to pace back and forth before his tent. He kept his boy busy replenishing the fire. A lion coughed and he went into his tent to reappear with an express rifle. Again he admonished the boy to throw more brush upon the fire. Korak saw that he was nervous and afraid, and his lip curled in a sneer of contempt. Was this the creature who had supplanted him in the heart of his Miriam? Was this a man who trembled when Numa coughed? How could such as he protect Miriam from the countless dangers of the jungle? Ah, but he would not have to. They would live in the safety of European civilization, where men in uniforms were hired to protect them. What need had a European of prowess to protect his mate? Again the sneer curled Korak's lip. Hansen and his boy had ridden directly to the clearing. It was already dark when they arrived. Leaving the boy there, Hansen rode to the edge of the plain, leading the boy's horse. There he waited. It was 9 o'clock before he saw a solitary figure galloping toward him from the direction of the bungalow. A few moments later Miriam drew in her mount beside him. She was nervous and flushed. When she recognized Hansen she drew back, startled. Mr. Bain's horse fell on him and sprained his ankle, Hansen hastened to explain. He couldn't very well come, so he sent me to meet you and bring you to camp. The girl could not see in the darkness the gloating, triumphant expression on the speaker's face. We had better hurry, continued Hansen, for we'll have to move along pretty fast if we don't want to be overtaken. Is he hurt badly? Asked Miriam. Only a little sprain, replied Hansen. He can ride all right, but we both thought he'd better lie up tonight and rest, for he'll have plenty hard riding in the next few weeks. Yes, agreed the girl. Hansen swung his pony about and Miriam followed him. They rode north along the edge of the jungle for a mile and then turned straight into it toward the west. Miriam, following, paid little attention to directions. She did not know exactly where Hansen's camp lay, and so she did not guess that he was not leading her toward it. All night they rode, straight toward the west. When morning came, Hansen permitted a short halt for breakfast, which he had provided in well-filled saddle bags before leaving his camp. Then they pushed on again, nor did they halt a second time until in the heat of the day he stopped and motioned the girl to dismount. We will sleep here for a time and let the ponies graze, he said. I had no idea the camp was so far away, said Miriam. I left orders that they were to move on at daybreak, explained the trader, so that we could get a good start. I knew that you and I could easily overtake a laden safari. It may not be until tomorrow that we'll catch up with them. But though they traveled part of the night and all the following day, no sign of the safari appeared ahead of them. Miriam, an adept in jungle craft, knew that none had passed ahead of them for many days. Occasionally she saw indications of an old spoor, a very old spoor, of many men. For the most part they followed this well-marked trail along elephant paths and through park-like groves. It was an ideal trail for rapid traveling. Miriam at last became suspicious. Gradually the attitude of the man at her side had begun to change. Often she surprised him devouring her with his eyes. Steadily the former sensation of previous acquaintanceship urged itself upon her. Somewhere, sometime before she had known this man, it was evident that he had not shaved for several days. A blonde stubble had commenced to cover his neck and cheeks and chin, and with it the assurance that he was no stranger continued to grow upon the girl. It was not until the second day, however, that Miriam rebelled. She drew in her pony at last and voiced her doubts. Hansen assured her that the camp was but a few miles further on. We should have overtaken them yesterday, he said. They must have marched much faster than I had believed possible. They have not marched here at all, said Miriam. The spoor that we have been following is weeks old. Hansen laughed. Oh, that's it, is it? He cried. Why didn't you say so before? I could have easily explained. We are not coming by the same route, but we'll pick up their trail sometime today, even if we don't overtake them. Now, At last, Miriam knew the man was lying to her. What a fool he must be to think that anyone could believe such a ridiculous explanation. Who was so stupid as to believe that they could have expected to overtake another party, and he had certainly assured her that momentarily he expected to do so, when that party's route was not to meet theirs for several miles yet. She kept her own counsel, however, planning to escape at the first opportunity when she might have a sufficient start of her captor, as she now considered him, to give her some assurance of outdistancing him. She watched his face continually when she could without being observed. Tantalizingly, the placing of his familiar features persisted in eluding her. Where had she known him? Under what conditions had they met before she had seen him about the farm of Bwana? She ran over in her mind all the few white men she ever had known. There were some who had come to her father's dua in the jungle. Few, it is true, but there had been some. Ah, now she had it. She had seen him there. She almost seized upon his identity, and then in an instant, it had slipped from her again. It was mid-afternoon when they suddenly broke out of the jungle upon the banks of a broad and placid river. Beyond, upon the opposite shore, Miriam described a camp surrounded by a high, thorn boma. "Here we are at last," said Hansen. He drew his revolver and fired in the air. Instantly the camp across the river was astir. Black men ran down the river's bank. Hansen hailed them. But there was no sign of the Honourable Morrison Baines. In accordance with their master's instructions, the blacks manned a canoe and rowed across. Hansen placed Miriam in the little craft and entered it himself, leaving two boys to watch the horses, which the canoe was to return for and swim across to the camp side of the river. Once in the camp, Miriam asked for Baines. For the moment her fears had been allayed by the sight of the camp, which she had come to look upon as more or less a myth. Hansen pointed toward the single tent that stood in the center of the enclosure. "There," he said, and preceded her toward it. At the entrance he held the flap aside and motioned her within. Miriam entered and looked about. The tent was empty. She turned toward Hansen. There was a broad grin on his face. "Where is Mr. Baines?" she demanded. "He ain't here," replied Hansen. "Leastwise I don't see him, do you? But I'm here, and I'm a damned sight better man than that thing ever was. You don't need him no more, you got me," and he laughed uproariously and reached for her. Miriam struggled to free herself. Hansen encircled her arms and body in his powerful grip and bore her slowly backward toward the pile of blankets at the far end of the tent. His face was bent close to hers. His eyes were narrowed to two slits of heat and passion and desire. Miriam was looking full into his face as she fought for freedom when there came over her a sudden recollection of a similar scene in which she had been a participant, and with it full recognition of her assailant. He was the Swede Malbin who had attacked her once before, who had shot his companion who would have saved her, and from whom she had been rescued by Bwana. His smooth face had deceived her, but now with the growing beard and the similarity of conditions, recognition came swift and sure. But today there would be no Bwana to save her. Chapter 21. The black boy whom Malbin had left awaiting him in the clearing with instructions to remain until he returned sat crouched at the foot of a tree for an hour when he was suddenly startled by the coughing grunt of a lion behind him. With celerity born of the fear of death the boy clambered into the branches of the tree, and a moment later the king of beasts entered the clearing and approached the carcass of an antelope which, until now, the boy had not seen. Until daylight the beast fed, while the black clung, sleepless, to his perch, wondering what had become of his master and the two ponies. He had been with Malbin for a year, and so was fairly conversant with the character of the white. His knowledge presently led him to believe that he had been purposely abandoned. Like the balance of Malbin's followers, this boy hated his master cordially, fear being the only bond that held him to the white man. His present uncomfortable predicament but added fuel to the fires of his hatred. As the sun rose, the lion withdrew into the jungle and the black descended from his tree and started upon his long journey back to camp. In his primitive brain revolved various fiendish plans for a revenge that he would not have the courage to put into effect when the test came and he stood face to face with one of the dominant race. A mile from the clearing he came upon the spoor of two ponies crossing his path at right angles. A cunning look entered the black's eyes. He laughed uproariously and slapped his thighs. Negroes are tireless gossipers, which, of course, is but a roundabout way of saying that they are human. Malbin's boys had been no exception to the rule, and as many of them had been with him at various times during the past 10 years, there was little about his acts and life in the African wilds that was not known directly or by hearsay to them all. And so, knowing his master and many of his past deeds, knowing, too, a great deal about the plans of Malbin and Baines that had been overheard by himself, or other servants, and knowing well from the gossip of the headmen that half of Malbin's party lay in camp by the great river far to the west, it was not difficult for the boy to put two and two together and arrive at four as the sum, the four being represented by a firm conviction that his master had deceived the other white man and taken the latter's woman to his western camp, leaving the other to suffer capture and punishment at the hands of the big Bwana whom all feared. Again the boy bared his rows of big, white teeth and laughed aloud. Then he resumed his northward way, traveling at a dogged trot that ate up the miles with marvelous rapidity. In the Swedes' camp the Honourable Morrison had spent an almost sleepless night of nervous apprehension and doubts and fears. Toward morning he had slept, utterly exhausted. It was the headman who awoke him shortly after sunrise to remind him that they must at once take up their northward journey. Baines hung back. He wanted to wait for Hansen and Miriam. The headman urged upon him the danger that lay in loitering. The fellow knew his master's plans sufficiently well to understand that he had done something to arouse the ire of the Big Bwana and that it would fare ill with them all if they were overtaken in Big Bwana's country. At the suggestion Baines took alarm. What if the Big Bwana, as the headman called him, had surprised Hansen in his nefarious work? Would he not guess the truth and possibly be already on the march to overtake and punish him? Baines had heard much of his host's summary method of dealing out punishment to malefactors great and small who transgressed the laws or customs of his savage little world which lay beyond the outer ramparts of what men are pleased to call frontiers. In this savage world where there was no law, the Big Bwana was law unto himself and all who dwelt about him. It was even rumored that he had extracted the death penalty from a white man who had maltreated a native girl. Baines shuddered at the recollection of this piece of gossip as he wondered what his host would exact of the man who had attempted to steal his young, white ward. The thought brought him to his feet. "Yes," he said, nervously, "we must get away from here at once. Do you know the trail to the north?" The headman did, and he lost no time in getting the safari upon the march. It was noon when a tired and sweat-covered runner overtook the trudging little column. The man was greeted with shouts of welcome from his fellows, to whom he imparted all that he knew and guessed of the actions of their master, so that the entire safari was aware of matters before Baines, who marched close to the head of the column, was reached and acquainted with the facts and the imaginings of the black boy whom Malbin had deserted in the clearing the night before. When the Honourable Morrison had listened to all that the boy had to say and realized that the trader had used him as a tool whereby he himself might get Miriam into his possession, his blood ran hot with rage and he trembled with apprehension for the girl's safety. That another contemplated no worse a deed than he had contemplated in no way palliated the hideousness of the other's offence. At first it did not occur to him that he would have wronged Miriam no less than he believed Hansen contemplated wronging her. Now his rage was more the rage of a man beaten at his own game and robbed of the prize that he had thought already his. "Do you know where your master has gone?" he asked the black. "Yes, Bwana," replied the boy. "He has gone to the other camp beside the big AFI that flows far toward the setting sun." "Can you take me to him?" demanded Baines. The boy nodded affirmatively. Here he saw a method of revenging himself upon his hated Bwana and at the same time of escaping the wrath of the big Bwana whom all were positive would first follow after the northerly safari. "Can you and I, alone, reach his camp?" asked the Honorable Morrison. "Yes, Bwana," assured the black. Baines turned toward the headman. He was conversing. Conversant with Hanson's plans now. He understood why he had wished to move the northern camp as far as possible toward the northern boundary of the Big Bwana's country. It would give him far more time to make his escape toward the west coast while the Big Bwana was chasing the northern contingent. Well, he would utilize the man's plans to his own end. He, too, must keep out of the clutches of his host. "You may take the men north as fast as possible," he said to the headman. "I shall return and attempt to lead the Big Bwana to the west." The Negro assented with a grunt. He had no desire to follow this strange white man who was afraid at night. He had less to remain at the tender mercies of the Big Bwana's lusty warriors, between whom and his people there was long-standing blood feud, and he was more than delighted, into the bargain, for a legitimate excuse for deserting his much-hated Swede master. He knew a way to the north and his own country that the white men did not know, a shortcut across an arid plateau where lay waterholes of which the white hunters and explorers that had passed from time to time the fringe of the dry country had never dreamed. He might even elude the Big Bwana should he follow them, and with this thought uppermost in his mind he gathered the remnants of Malbin's safari into a semblance of order and moved off toward the north. And toward the southwest the black boy led the Honorable Morrison Baines into the jungles. Korak had waited about the camp, watching the Honorable Morrison until the safari had started north. Then, assured that the young Englishman was going in the wrong direction to meet Miriam, he had abandoned him and returned slowly to the point where he had seen the girl, for whom his heart yearned, in the arms of another. So great had been his happiness at seeing Miriam alive that, for the instant, no thought of jealousy had entered his mind. Later these thoughts had come, dark, bloody thoughts that would have made the flesh of the Honorable Morrison creep could he have guessed that they were revolving in the brain of a savage creature creeping stealthily among the branches of the forest giant beneath which he waited the coming of Hanson and the girl. And with passing of the hours had come subdued reflection in which he had weighed himself against the trimly clad English gentleman and found that he was wanting. What had he to offer her by comparison with that which the other man might offer? What was his mess of pottage to the birthright that the other had preserved? How could he dare go, naked and unkempt, to that fair thing who had once been his jungle fellow and propose the thing that had been in his mind when first the realization of his love had swept over him? He shuddered as he thought of the irreparable wrong that his love would have done the innocent child but for the chance that had snatched her from him before it was too late. Doubtless she knew now the horror that had been in his mind. Doubtless she hated and loathed him as he hated and loathed himself when he let his mind dwell upon it. He had lost her. No more surely had she been lost when he thought her dead than she was in reality now that he had seen her living in the guise of a refinement that had transfigured and sanctified her. He had loved her before, now he worshipped her. He knew that he might never possess her now, but at least he might see her. From a distance he might look upon her. Perhaps he might serve her, but never must she guess that he had found her or that he lived. He wondered if she ever thought of him, if the happy days that they had spent together never recurred to her mind. It seemed unbelievable that such could be the case, and yet, too, it seemed almost equally unbelievable that this beautiful girl was the same disheveled, half-naked, little sprite who skipped nimbly among the branches of the trees as they ran and played in the lazy, happy days of the past. It could not be that her memory held more of the past than did her new appearance. It was a sad Korak who ranged the jungle near the plain's edge waiting for the coming of his Mariam, the Mariam who never came. But there came another, a tall, broad-shouldered man in khaki at the head of a swarthy crew of ebon warriors. The man's face was set in hard, stern lines and the marks of sorrow were writ deep about his mouth and eyes, so deep that the set expression of rage upon his features could not obliterate them. Korak saw the man pass beneath him where he hid in the great tree that had harbored him before upon the edge of that fateful little clearing. He saw him come and he sat rigid and frozen and suffering above him. He saw him search the ground with his keen eyes, and he only sat there watching with eyes that glazed from the intensity of his gaze. He saw him sign to his men that he had come upon that which he sought and he saw him pass out of sight toward the north, and still Korak sat like a graven image, with a heart that bled in dumb misery. An hour later Korak moved slowly away, back into the jungle toward the west. He went listlessly, with bent head and stooped shoulders, like an old man who bore upon his back the weight of a great sorrow. Baines, following his black guide, battled his way through the dense underbrush, riding stooped low over his horse's neck, or often he dismounted where the low branches swept too close to earth to permit him to remain in the saddle. The black was taking him the shortest way, which was no way at all for a horseman, and after the first day's march the young Englishman was forced to abandon his mount, and follow his nimble guide entirely on foot. During the long hours of marching the Honourable Morrison had much time to devote to thought, and as he pictured the probable fate of Mariam at the hands of the Swede his rage against the man became the greater. But presently there came to him a realization of the fact that his own base plans had led the girl into this terrible predicament, and that even had she escaped Hansen she would have found but little better deserts awaiting her with him. There came too, the realization that Mariam was infinitely more precious to him than he had imagined. For the first time he commenced to compare her with other women of his acquaintance, women of birth and position, and almost to his surprise, he discovered that the young Arab girl suffered less than they by the comparison. And then from hating Hansen he came to look upon himself with hate and loathing, to see himself and his perfidious act in all their contemptible hideousness. Thus, in the crucible of shame amidst the white heat of naked truths, the passion that the man had felt for the girl he had considered his social inferior was transmuted into love. And as he staggered on there burned within him beside his newborn love another great passion, the passion of hate urging him on to the consummation of revenge. A creature of ease and luxury, he had never been subjected to the hardships and tortures which now were his constant companionship, yet, his clothing torn, his flesh scratched and bleeding, he urged the black to greater speed, though with every dozen steps he himself fell from exhaustion. It was revenge which kept him going, that in a feeling that in his suffering he was partially expiating the great wrong he had done the girl he loved, for hope of saving her from the fate into which he had trapped her had never existed. Too late. Too late, was the dismal accompaniment of thought to which he marched. Too late. Too late to save, but not too late to avenge. That kept him up. Only when it became too dark to see would he permit of a halt. A dozen times in the afternoon he had threatened the black with instant death when the tired guide insisted upon resting. The fellow was terrified. He could not understand the remarkable change that had so suddenly come over the white man who had been afraid in the dark the night before. He would have deserted this terrifying master had he had the opportunity, but Baines guessed that some such thought might be in the other's mind, and so gave the fellow none. He kept close to him by day and slept touching him at night in the rude thorn boma they constructed as a slight protection against prowling carnivora. That the Honourable Morrison could sleep at all in the midst of the savage jungle was sufficient indication that he had changed considerably in the past 24 hours, and that he could lie close beside a none too fragrant black man spoke of possibilities for democracy within him yet all undreamed of. Morning found him stiff and lame and sore, but none the less determined to push on in pursuit of Hansen as rapidly as possible. With his rifle he brought down a buck at a ford in a small stream shortly after they broke camp, breakfastless. Begrudgingly he permitted a halt while they cooked and ate, and then on again through the wilderness of trees and vines and underbrush. And in the meantime Korak wandered slowly westward, coming upon the trail of Tanta, the elephant, whom he overtook browsing in the deep shade of the jungle. The ape-man, lonely and sorrowing, was glad of the companionship of his huge friend. Affectionately the sinuous trunk encircled him, and he was swung to the mighty back where so often before he had lolled and dreamed the long afternoon away. Far to the north the big Bwana and his black warriors clung tenaciously to the trail of the fleeing safari that was luring them further and further from the girl they sought to save, while back at the bungalow the woman who had loved Miriam as though she had been her own waited impatiently and in sorrow for the return of the rescuing party and the girl she was positive her invincible lord and master would bring back with him. Chapter 22. As Miriam struggled with Malbin, her hands pinioned to her sides by his brawny grip, hope died within her. She did not utter a sound for she knew that there was none to come to her assistance, and, too, the jungle training of her earlier life had taught her the futility of appeals for succor in the savage world of her upbringing. But as she fought to free herself one hand came in contact with the butt of Malbin's revolver where it rested in the holster at his hip. Slowly he was dragging her toward the blankets, and slowly her fingers encircled the coveted prize and drew it from its resting place. Then, as Malbin stood at the edge of the disordered pile of blankets, Miriam suddenly ceased to draw away from him, and as quickly hurled her weight against him with the result that he was thrown backward, his feet stumbled against the bedding and he was hurled to his back. Instinctively his hands flew out to save himself and at the same instant Miriam leveled the revolver at his breast and pulled the trigger. But the hammer fell futilely upon an empty shell, and Malbin was again upon his feet clutching at her. For a moment she eluded him, and ran toward the entrance to the tent, but at the very doorway his heavy hand fell upon her shoulder and dragged her back. Wheeling upon him with the fury of a wounded lioness Miriam grasped the long revolver by the barrel, swung it high above her head and crushed it down full in Malbin's face. With an oath of pain and rage the man staggered backward, releasing his hold upon her and then sank unconscious to the ground. Without a backward look Miriam turned and fled into the open. Several of the blacks saw her and tried to intercept her flight, but the menace of the empty weapon kept them at a distance. And so she won beyond the encircling boma and disappeared into the jungle to the south. Straight into the branches of a tree she went, true to the arboreal instincts of the little Mangani she had been, and here she stripped off her riding skirt, her shoes, and her stockings, for she knew that she had before her a journey and a flight which would not brook the burden of these garments. Her riding breeches and jacket would have to serve as protection from cold and thorns, nor would they hamper her overmuch, but a skirt and shoes were impossible among the trees. She had not gone far before she commenced to realize how slight were her chances for survival without means of defense or a weapon to bring down meat. Why had she not thought to strip the cartridge belt from Malbin's waist before she had left his tent? With cartridges for the revolver she might hope to bag small game, and to protect herself from all but the most ferocious of the enemies that would beset her way back to the beloved hearthstone of Bwana and my dear. With the thought came determination to return and obtain the coveted ammunition. She realized that she was taking great chances of recapture, but without means of defense and of obtaining meat she felt that she could never hope to reach safety. And so she turned her face back toward the camp from which she had but just escaped. She thought Malbin dead, so terrific a blow had she dealt him, and she hoped to find an opportunity after dark to enter the camp and search his tent for the cartridge belt, but scarcely had she found a hiding place in a great tree at the edge of the boma where she could watch without danger of being discovered, when she saw the Swede emerge from his tent, wiping blood from his face, and hurling a volley of oaths and questions at his terrified followers. Shortly after the entire camp set forth in search of her, and when Miriam was positive that all were gone she descended from her hiding place and ran quickly across the clearing to Malbin's tent. A hasty survey of the interior revealed no ammunition, but in one corner was a box in which were packed the Swede's personal belongings that he had sent along by his headman to this westerly camp. Miriam seized the receptacle as the possible container of extra ammunition. Quickly she loosed the cords that held the canvas covering about the box, and a moment later had raised the lid and was rummaging through the heterogeneous accumulation of odds and ends within. There were letters and papers and cuttings from old newspapers, and among other things the photograph of a little girl upon the back of which was pasted a cutting from a Paris daily, a cutting that she could not read, yellowed and dimmed by age and handling, but something about the photograph of the little girl which was also reproduced in the newspaper cutting held her attention. Where had she seen that picture before? And then, quite suddenly, it came to her that this was a picture of herself as she had been years and years before. Where had it been taken? How had it come into the possession of this man? Why had it been reproduced in a newspaper? What was the story that the faded type told of it? Miriam was baffled by the puzzle that her search for ammunition had revealed. She stood gazing at the faded photograph for a time and then bethought herself of the ammunition for which she had come. Turning again to the box, she rummaged to the bottom, and there in a corner she came upon a little box of cartridges. A single glance assured her that they were intended for the weapon she had thrust inside the band of her riding breeches, and slipping them into her pocket she turned once more for an examination of the baffling likeness of herself that she held in her hand. As she stood thus in vain endeavor to fathom this inexplicable mystery, the sound of voices broke upon her ears. Instantly she was all alert. They were coming closer. A second later she recognized the lurid profanity of the Swede. Malbin, her persecutor, was returning. Miriam ran quickly to the opening of the tent and looked out. It was too late. She was fairly cornered. The white man and 3 of his black henchmen were coming straight across the clearing toward the tent. What was she to do? She slipped the photograph into her waist. Quickly she slipped a cartridge into each of the chambers of the revolver. Then she backed toward the end of the tent, keeping the entrance covered by her weapon. The man stopped outside, and Miriam could hear Malbin profanely issuing instructions. He was a long time about it, and while he talked in his bellowing, brutish voice, the girl sought some avenue of escape. Stooping, she raised the bottom of the canvas and looked beneath and beyond. There was no one in sight upon that side. Throwing herself upon her stomach, she wormed beneath the tent wall just as Malbin, with a final word to his men, entered the tent. Miriam heard him cross the floor, and then she rose and, stooping low, ran to a native hut directly behind. Once inside this she turned and glanced back. There was no one in sight. She had not been seen. And now from Malbin's tent she heard a great cursing. The Swede had discovered the rifling of his box. He was shouting to his men, and as she heard them reply, Miriam darted from the hut and ran toward the edge of the boma furthest from Malbin's tent. Overhanging the boma at this point was a tree that had been too large, in the eyes of the rest-loving blacks, to cut down. So they had terminated the boma just short of it. Miriam was thankful for whatever circumstance had resulted in the leaving of that particular tree where it was, since it gave her the much-needed avenue of escape which she might not otherwise have had. From her hiding place she saw Malbin again enter the jungle, this time leaving a guard of 3 of his boys in the camp. He went toward the south, and after he had disappeared, Miriam skirted the outside of the enclosure and made her way to the river. Here lay the canoes that had been used in bringing the party from the opposite shore. They were unwieldy things for a lone girl to handle, but there was no other way and she must cross the river. The landing place was in full view of the guard at the camp. To risk the crossing under their eyes would have meant undoubted capture. Her only hope lay in waiting until darkness had fallen, unless some fortuitous circumstance should arise before. For an hour she lay watching the guard, one of whom seemed always in a position where he would immediately discover her should she attempt to launch one of the canoes. Presently Malbin appeared, coming out of the jungle, hot and puffing. He ran immediately to the river where the canoes lay and counted them. It was evident that it had suddenly occurred to him that the girl must cross here if she wished to return to her protectors. The expression of relief on his face when he found that none of the canoes was gone was ample evidence of what was passing in his mind. He turned and spoke hurriedly to the headman who had followed him out of the jungle and with whom were several other blacks. Following Malbin's instructions, they launched all the canoes but one. Malbin called to the guards in the camp, and a moment later the entire party had entered the boats and were paddling upstream. Miriam watched them until a bend in the river directly above the camp hid them from her sight. They were gone. She was alone, and they had left a canoe in which lay a paddle. She could scarce believe the good fortune that had come to her. To delay now would be suicidal to her hopes. Quickly she ran from her hiding place and dropped to the ground. A dozen yards lay between her and the canoe. Upstream, beyond the bend, Malbin ordered his canoes into shore. He landed with his headman and crossed the little point slowly in search of a spot where he might watch the canoe he had left at the landing place. He was smiling in anticipation of the almost certain success of his stratagem. Sooner or later the girl would come back and attempt to cross the river in one of their canoes. It might be that the idea would not occur to her for some time. They might have to wait a day, or 2 days, but that she would come if she lived or was not captured by the men he had scouting the jungle for her, Malbin was sure. That she would come so soon, however, he had not guessed, and so when he topped the point and came again within sight of the river, he saw that which drew an angry oath from his lips: his quarry already was halfway across the river. Turning, he ran rapidly back to his boats, the headman at his heels. Throwing themselves in, Malbin urged his paddlers to their most powerful efforts. The canoes shot out into the stream and down with the current toward the fleeing quarry. She had almost completed the crossing when they came in sight of her. At the same instant she saw them, and redoubled her efforts to reach the opposite shore before they should overtake her. 2 minutes' start of them was all Miriam cared for. Once in the trees she knew that she could outdistance and elude them. Her hopes were high; they could not overtake her now, she had had too good a start of them. Malbin, urging his men onward with a stream of hideous oaths and blows from his fists, realized that the girl was again slipping from his clutches. The leading canoe, in the bow of which he stood, was yet 100 yards behind the fleeing Miriam when she ran the point of her craft beneath the overhanging trees on the shore of safety. Malbin screamed to her to halt. He seemed to have gone mad with rage at the realization that he could not overtake her, and then he threw his rifle to his shoulder, aimed carefully at the slim figure scrambling into the trees, and fired. Malbin was an excellent shot. His misses at so short a distance were practically non-existent, nor would he have missed this time but for an accident occurring at the very instant that his finger tightened upon the trigger, an accident to which Miriam owed her life: the providential presence of a waterlogged tree trunk, one end of which was embedded in the mud of the river bottom and the other end of which floated just beneath the surface where the prow of Malbin's canoe ran upon it as he fired. The slight deviation of the boat's direction was sufficient to throw the muzzle of the rifle out of aim. The bullet whizzed harmlessly by Miriam's head, and an instant later she had disappeared into the foliage of the tree. There was a smile on her lips as she dropped to the ground to cross a little clearing where once had stood a native village surrounded by its fields. The ruined huts still stood in crumbling decay. The rank vegetation of the jungle overgrew the cultivated ground. Small trees already had sprung up in what had been the village street, but desolation and loneliness hung like a pall above the scene. To Miriam, however, it presented but a place denuded of large trees which she must cross quickly to regain the jungle upon the opposite side before Malbin should have landed. The deserted huts were, to her, all the better because they were deserted. She did not see the keen eyes watching her from a dozen points, from tumbling doorways, from behind tottering granaries. In utter unconsciousness of impending danger she started up the village street because it offered the clearest pathway to the jungle. A mile away toward the east, fighting his way through the jungle along the trail taken by Malbin when he had brought Miriam to his camp, a man in torn khaki, filthy, haggard, unkempt, came to a sudden stop as the report of Malbin's rifle resounded faintly through the tangled forest. The black man just ahead of him stopped, too. "We are almost there, Bwana," he said. There was awe and respect in his tone and manner. The white man nodded and motioned his ebon guide forward once more. It was the Honorable Morrison Baines, the fastidious, the exquisite. His face and hands were scratched and smeared with dried blood from the wounds he had come by in thorn and thicket. His clothes were tatters. But through the blood and the dirt and the rags a new Baines shone forth, a handsomer Baines than the dandy and the fop of yore. In the heart and soul of every son of woman lies the germ of manhood and honor. Remorse for a scurvy act, and an honorable desire to right the wrong he had done the woman he now knew he really loved had excited these germs to rapid growth in Morrison Baines, and the metamorphosis had taken place. Onward the two stumbled toward the point from which the single rifle shot had come. The black was unarmed. Baines, fearing his loyalty, had not dared trust him even to carry the rifle which the white man would have been glad to be relieved of many times upon the long march, but now that they were approaching their goal, and knowing as he did that hatred of Malbin burned hot in the black man's brain, Baines handed him the rifle, for he guessed that there would be fighting. He intended that there should, for he had come to avenge himself. An excellent revolver shot would depend upon the smaller weapon at his side. As the two forged ahead toward their goal, they were startled by a volley of shots ahead of them. Then came a few scattering reports, some savage yells, and silence. Baines was frantic in his endeavors to advance more rapidly, but there the jungle seemed 1,000 times more tangled than before. A dozen times he tripped and fell. Twice the black followed a blind trail and they were forced to retrace their steps, but at last they came out into a little clearing near the big AFI, a clearing that once held a thriving village, but lay somber and desolate in decay and ruin. In the jungle vegetation that overgrew what had once been the main village street lay the body of a black man, pierced through the heart with a bullet, and still warm. Baines and his companion looked about in all directions, but no sign of living being could they discover. They stood in silence listening intently. What was that? Voices and the dip of paddles out upon the river. Baines ran across the dead village toward the fringe of jungle upon the river's brim. The black was at his side. Together they forced their way through the screening foliage until they could obtain a view of the river, and there, almost to the other shore, they saw Malbin's canoes making rapidly for camp. The black recognized his companions immediately. "How can we cross?" asked Baines. The black shook his head. There was no canoe and the crocodiles made it equivalent to suicide to enter the water in an attempt to swim across. Just then the fellow chanced to glance downward. Beneath him, wedged among the branches of a tree, lay the canoe in which Miriam had escaped. The Negro grasped Baines' arm and pointed toward his find. The Honorable Morrison could scarce repress a shout of exultation. Quickly the two slid down the drooping branches into the boat. The black seized the paddle and Baines shoved them out from beneath the tree. A second later the canoe shot out upon the bosom of the river and headed toward the opposite shore and the camp of the Swede. Baines squatted in the bow, straining his eyes after the men pulling the other canoes upon the bank across from him. He saw Malbin step from the bow of the foremost of the little craft. He saw him turn and glance back across the river. He could see his start of surprise as his eyes fell upon the pursuing canoe, and called the attention of his followers to it. Then he stood waiting, for there was but one canoe and two men, little danger to him and his followers in that. Malbin was puzzled. Who was this white man? He did not recognize him, though Baines' canoe was now in midstream and the features of both its occupants plainly discernible to those on shore. One of Malbin's blacks it was who first recognized his fellow black in the person of Baines' companion. Then Malbin guessed who the white man must be, though he could scarce believe his own reasoning. It seemed beyond the pale of wildest conjecture to suppose that the Honorable Morrison Baines had followed him through the jungle with but a single companion, and yet it was true. Beneath the dirt and dishevelment he recognized him at last, and in the necessity of admitting that it was he, Malbin was forced to recognize the incentive that had driven Baines, the weakling and coward, through the savage jungle upon his trail. The man had come to demand an accounting and to avenge. It seemed incredible, and yet there could be no other explanation. Malbin shrugged. Well, others had sought Malbin for similar reasons in the course of a long and checkered career. He fingered his rifle, and waited. Now the canoe was within easy speaking distance of the shore. "What do you want?" yelled Malbin, raising his weapon threateningly. The Honorable Morrison Baines leaped to his feet. "You, damn you," he shouted, whipping out his revolver and firing almost simultaneously with the Swede. As the two reports rang out, Malbin dropped his rifle, clutched frantically at his breast, staggered, fell first to his knees and then lunged upon his face. Baines stiffened. His head flew back spasmodically. For an instant he stood thus, and then crumpled very gently into the bottom of the boat. The black paddler was at a loss as to what to do. If Malbin really were dead, he could continue on to join his fellows without fear, but should the Swede only be wounded, he would be safer upon the far shore. Therefore he hesitated, holding the canoe in midstream. He had come to have considerable respect for his new master and was not unmoved by his death. As he sat gazing at the crumpled body in the bow of the boat, he saw it move. Very feebly the man essayed to turn over. He still lived. The black moved forward and lifted him to a sitting position. He was standing in front of him, his paddle in one hand, asking Baines where he was hit when there was another shot from shore and the Negro pitched headlong overboard, his paddle still clutched in his dead fingers, shot through the forehead. Baines turned weakly in the direction of the shore to see Malbin drawn up upon his elbows, leveling his rifle at him. The Englishman slid to the bottom of the canoe as a bullet whizzed above him. Malbin, sore hit, took longer in aiming, nor was his aim as sure as formerly. With difficulty Baines turned himself over on his belly and, grasping his revolver in his right hand, drew himself up until he could look over the edge of the canoe. Malbin saw him instantly and fired, but Baines did not flinch or duck. With painstaking care he aimed at the target upon the shore, from which he now was drifting with the current. His finger closed upon the trigger, there was a flash and a report, and Malbin's giant frame jerked to the impact of another bullet. But he was not yet dead. Again he aimed and fired, the bullet splintering the gunwale of the canoe close by Baines' face. Baines fired again as his canoe drifted further downstream, and Malbin answered from the shore where he lay in a pool of his own blood. And thus, doggedly, the two wounded men continued to carry on their weird duel until the winding African river had carried the Honorable Morrison Baines out of sight around a wooded point. Chapter 23. Miriam had traversed half the length of the village street when a score of white-robed Negroes and half-castes leaped out upon her from the dark interiors of surrounding huts. She turned to flee, but heavy hands seized her, and when she turned at last to plead with them, her eyes fell upon the face of a tall, grim, old man glaring down upon her from beneath the folds of his burnous. At sight of him she staggered back in shocked and terrified surprise. It was the Sheikh. Instantly all the old fears and terrors of her childhood returned upon her. She stood trembling before this horrible old man, as a murderer before the judge about to pass sentence of death upon him. She knew that the Sheikh recognized her. The years and the changed raiment had not altered her so much, but what one who had known her features so well in childhood would know her now. "So you have come back to your people, eh?" snarled the Sheikh. "Come back begging for food and protection, eh?" "Let me go," cried the girl. "I ask nothing of you, but that ye let me go back to the Big Bwana." "The Big Bwana," almost screamed the Sheikh, and then followed a stream of profane, Arabic invective against the white man whom all the transgressors of the jungle feared and hated. "You would go back to the Big Bwana, would you? So that is where you have been since you ran away from me, is it? And who comes now across the river after you, the Big Bwana? The Swede whom you once chased away from your country when he and his companion conspired with Nbida to steal me from you," replied Mariam. The sheik's eyes blazed, and he called his men to approach the shore and hide among the bushes that they might ambush and annihilate Malbin and his party. But Malbin already had landed and crawling through the fringe of jungle was at that very moment looking with wide and incredulous eyes upon the scene being enacted in the street of the deserted village. He recognized the sheikh the moment his eyes fell upon him. There were two men in the world that Malbin feared as he feared the devil. One was the big bwana and the other the sheikh. A single glance he took at that gaunt, familiar figure and then he turned tail and scurried back to his canoe calling his followers after him. And so it happened that the party was well out in the stream before the sheikh reached the shore, and after a volley and a few parting shots that were returned from the canoes the Arab called his men off and securing his prisoner set off toward the south. One of the bullets from Malbin's force had struck a black standing in the village street where he had been left with another to guard Mariam, and his companions had left him where he had fallen, after appropriating his apparel and belongings. His was the body that Baines had discovered when he had entered the village. The sheikh and his party had been marching southward along the river when one of them, dropping out of line to fetch water, had seen Mariam paddling desperately from the opposite shore. The fellow had called the sheikh's attention to the strange sight, a white woman alone in Central Africa, and the old Arab had hidden his men in the deserted village to capture her when she landed, for thoughts of ransom were always in the mind of the sheikh. More than once before had glittering gold filtered through his fingers from a similar source. It was easy money, and the sheikh had none too much easy money since the big bwana had so circumscribed the limits of his ancient domain that he dared not even steal ivory from natives within 200 miles of the big bwana's dua. And when at last the woman had walked into the trap he had set for her and he had recognized her as the same little girl he had brutalized and maltreated years before, his gratification had been huge. Now he lost no time in establishing the old relations of father and daughter that had existed between them in the past. At the first opportunity he struck her a heavy blow across the face. He forced her to walk when he might have dismounted one of his men instead, or had her carried on a horse's rump. He seemed to revel in the discovery of new methods for torturing or humiliating her, and among all his followers she found no single one to offer her sympathy, or who dared defend her, even had they had the desire to do so. A 2 days' march brought them at last to the familiar scenes of her childhood, and the first face upon which she set her eyes as she was driven through the gates into the strong stockade was that of the toothless, hideous Mbunu, her one-time nurse. It was as though all the years that had intervened were but a dream. Had it not been for her clothing and the fact that she had grown in stature, she might well have believed it so. All was there as she had left it. The new faces which supplanted some of the old were of the same bestial, degraded type. There were a few young Arabs who had joined the sheikh since she had been away. Otherwise all was the same, all but one. Geeka was not there, and she found herself missing Geeka as though the ivory-headed one had been a flesh and blood intimate and friend. She missed her ragged little confidant, into whose deaf ears she had been wont to pour her many miseries and her occasional joys, Geeka, of the splinter limbs and the rat-skin torso, Geeka the disreputable, Geeka the beloved. For a time the inhabitants of the sheikh's village who had not been upon the march with him amused themselves by inspecting the strangely clad white girl, whom some of them had known as a little child. Mbunu pretended great joy at her return, baring her toothless gums in a hideous grimace that was intended to be indicative of rejoicing. But Mariam could but shudder as she recalled the cruelties of this terrible old hag in the years gone by. Among the Arabs who had come in her absence was a tall young fellow of 20, a handsome, sinister-looking youth, who stared at her in open admiration until the sheikh came and ordered him away, and Abdul Kamak went, scowling. At last, their curiosity satisfied, Mariam was alone. As of old, she was permitted the freedom of the village, for the stockade was high and strong and the only gates were well guarded by day and by night, but as of old she cared not for the companionship of the cruel Arabs and the degraded blacks who formed the following of the sheikh, and so, as had been her wont in the sad days of her childhood, she slunk down to an unfrequented corner of the enclosure where she had often played at housekeeping with her beloved Geeka beneath the spreading branches of the great tree that had overhung the palisade, but now the tree was gone, and Miriam guessed the reason. It was from this tree that Korak had descended and struck down the Shek the day that he had rescued her from the life of misery and torture that had been her lot for so long that she could remember no other. There were low bushes growing within the stockade, however, and in the shade of these Miriam sat down to think. A little glow of happiness warmed her heart as she recalled her first meeting with Korak and then the long years that he had cared for and protected her with the solicitude and purity of an elder brother. For months Korak had not so occupied her thoughts as he did today. He seemed closer and dearer now than ever he had before, and she wondered that her heart had drifted so far from loyalty to his memory. And then came the image of the Honourable Morrison, the exquisite, and Miriam was troubled. Did she really love the flawless young Englishman? She thought of the glories of London, of which he had told her in such glowing language. She tried to picture herself admired and honoured in the midst of the gayest society of the great capital. The pictures she drew were the pictures that the Honourable Morrison had drawn for her. They were alluring pictures, but through them all the brawny, half-naked figure of the giant Adonis of the jungle persisted in obtruding itself. Miriam pressed her hand above her heart as she stifled a sigh, and as she did so she felt the hard outlines of the photograph she had hidden there as she slunk from Malbin's tent. Now she drew it forth and commenced to re-examine it more carefully than she had had time to do before. She was sure that the baby face was hers. She studied every detail of the picture. Half hidden in the lace of the dainty dress rested a chain and locket. Miriam puckered her brows. What tantalizing half-memories it awakened! Could this flower of evident civilization be the little Arab Miriam, daughter of the Sheikh? It was impossible, and yet that locket. Miriam knew it. She could not refute the conviction of her memory. She had seen that locket before and it had been hers. What strange mystery lay buried in her past? As she sat gazing at the picture she suddenly became aware that she was not alone, that someone was standing close behind her, someone who had approached her noiselessly. Guiltily she thrust the picture back into her waist. A hand fell upon her shoulder. She was sure that it was the Sheikh and she awaited in dumb terror the blow that she knew would follow. No blow came and she looked upward over her shoulder, into the eyes of Abdul Kamak, the young Arab. "I saw," he said, "the picture that you have just hidden. It is you when you were a child, a very young child. May I see it again?" Miriam drew away from him. "I will give it back," he said. "I have heard of you and I know that you have no love for the Sheikh, your father. Neither have I. I will not betray you. Let me see the picture." Friendless among cruel enemies, Miriam clutched at the straw that Abdul Kamak held out to her. Perhaps in him she might find the friend she needed. Anyway, he had seen the picture and if he was not a friend he could tell the Sheikh about it and it would be taken away from her. So she might as well grant his request and hope that he had spoken fairly, and would deal fairly. She drew the photograph from its hiding place and handed it to him. Abdul Kamak examined it carefully, comparing it, feature by feature with the girl sitting on the ground looking up into his face. Slowly he nodded his head. "Yes," he said, "it is you, but where was it taken? How does it happen that the Sheikh's daughter is clothed in the garments of the unbeliever?" "I do not know," replied Miriam. "I never saw the picture until a couple of days ago, when I found it in the tent of the Swede, Malbin." Abdul Kamak raised his eyebrows. He turned the picture over and as his eyes fell upon the old newspaper cutting they went wide. He could read French, with difficulty, it is true, but he could read it. He had been to Paris. He had spent 6 months there with a troop of his desert fellows, upon exhibition, and he had improved his time, learning many of the customs, some of the language, and most of the vices of his conquerors. Now he put his learning to use. Slowly, laboriously he read the yellowed cutting. His eyes were no longer wide. Instead they narrowed to 2 slits of cunning. When he had done he looked at the girl. "You have read this?" he asked. It is French, she replied, and I do not read French. Abdul Kamak stood long in silence looking at the girl. She was very beautiful. He desired her, as had many other men who had seen her. At last he dropped to one knee beside her. A wonderful idea had sprung to Abdul Kamak's mind. It was an idea that might be furthered if the girl were kept in ignorance of the contents of that newspaper cutting. It would certainly be doomed should she learn its contents. Miriam, he whispered, never until today have my eyes beheld you, yet at once they told my heart that it must ever be your servant. You do not know me, but I ask that you trust me. I can help you. You hate the Sheikh, so do I. Let me take you away from him. Come with me, and we will go back to the great desert where my father is a Sheikh mightier than is yours. Will you come? Miriam sat in silence. She hated to wound the only one who had offered her protection and friendship, but she did not want Abdul Kamak's love. Deceived by her silence, the man seized her and strained her to him, but Miriam struggled to free herself. I do not love you, she cried. Oh, please do not make me hate you. You are the only one who has shown kindness toward me, and I want to like you, but I cannot love you. Abdul Kamak drew himself to his full height. You will learn to love me, he said, for I shall take you whether you will or no. You hate the Sheikh and so you will not tell him, for if you do I will tell him of the picture. I hate the Sheikh, and you hate the Sheikh, came a grim voice from behind them. Both turned to see the Sheikh standing a few paces from them. Abdul still held the picture in his hand. Now he thrust it within his burnous. Yes, he said, I hate the Sheikh, and as he spoke he sprang toward the older man, felled him with a blow and dashed on across the village to the line where his horse was picketed, saddled and ready, for Abdul Kamak had been about to ride forth to hunt when he had seen the stranger girl alone by the bushes. Leaping into the saddle, Abdul Kamak dashed for the village gates. The Sheikh, momentarily stunned by the blow that had felled him, now staggered to his feet, shouting lustily to his followers to stop the escaped Arab. A dozen blacks leaped forward to intercept the horseman, only to be ridden down or brushed aside by the muzzle of Abdul Kamak's long musket, which he lashed from side to side about him as he spurred on toward the gate. But here he must surely be intercepted. Already the two blacks stationed there were pushing the unwieldy portals to. Up flew the barrel of the fugitive's weapon. With reins flying loose and his horse at a mad gallop, the son of the desert fired once, twice, and both the keepers of the gate dropped in their tracks. With a wild whoop of exultation, twirling his musket high above his head and turning in his saddle to laugh back into the faces of his pursuers, Abdul Kamak dashed out of the village of the Sheikh and was swallowed up by the jungle. Foaming with rage, the Sheikh ordered immediate pursuit, and then strode rapidly back to where Miriam sat huddled by the bushes where he had left her. The picture, he cried. What picture did the dog speak of? Where is it? Give it to me at once. He took it, replied Miriam, dully. What was it? Again demanded the Sheikh, seizing the girl roughly by the hair and dragging her to her feet, where he shook her venomously. What was it a picture of? Of me, said Miriam, when I was a little girl. I stole it from Malbin, the Swede. It had printing on the back cut from an old newspaper. The Sheikh went white with rage. What said the printing? He asked in a voice so low that she but barely caught his words. I do not know. It was in French and I cannot read French. The Sheikh seemed relieved. He almost smiled, nor did he again strike Miriam before he turned and strode away with the parting admonition that she speak never again to any other than Mabunu and himself. And along the caravan trail galloped Abdul Kamak toward the north. As his canoe drifted out of sight and range of the wounded Swede, the Honourable Morrison sank weakly to its bottom where he lay for long hours in partial stupor. It was night before he fully regained consciousness. And then he lay for a long time looking up at the stars and trying to recollect where he was, what accounted for the gently rocking motion of the thing upon which he lay, and why the position of the stars changed so rapidly and miraculously. For a while he thought he was dreaming, but when he would have moved to shake sleep from him, the pain of his wound recalled to him the events that had led up to his present position. Then it was that he realized that he was floating down a great African river in a native canoe alone, wounded, and lost. Painfully he dragged himself to a sitting position. He noticed that the wound pained him less than he had imagined it would. He felt of it gingerly; it had ceased to bleed. Possibly it was but a flesh wound after all, and nothing serious. If it totally incapacitated him even for a few days, it would mean death, for by that time he would be too weakened by hunger and pain to provide food for himself. From his own troubles his mind turned to Miriam's. That she had been with the Swede at the time he had attempted to reach the fellow's camp he naturally believed, but he wondered what would become of her now. Even if Hansen died of his wounds, would Miriam be any better off? She was in the power of equally villainous men, brutal savages of the lowest order. Baines buried his face in his hands and rocked back and forth as the hideous picture of her fate burned itself into his consciousness. And it was he who had brought this fate upon her. His wicked desire had snatched a pure and innocent girl from the protection of those who loved her to hurl her into the clutches of the bestial Swede and his outcast following. And not until it had become too late had he realized the magnitude of the crime he himself had planned and contemplated. Not until it had become too late had he realized that greater than his desire, greater than his lust, greater than any passion he had ever felt before was the newborn love that burned within his breast for the girl he would have ruined. The Honorable Morrison Baines did not fully realize the change that had taken place within him. Had one suggested that he ever had been aught than the soul of honor and chivalry, he would have taken umbrage forthwith. He knew that he had done a vile thing when he had plotted to carry Miriam away to London, yet he excused it on the ground of his great passion for the girl having temporarily warped his moral standards by the intensity of its heat. But, as a matter of fact, a new Baines had been born. Never again could this man be bent to dishonor by the intensity of a desire. His moral fiber had been strengthened by the mental suffering he had endured. His mind and his soul had been purged by sorrow and remorse. His one thought now was to atone, win to Miriam's side and lay down his life, if necessary, in her protection. His eyes sought the length of the canoe in search of the paddle, for a determination had galvanized him to immediate action despite his weakness and his wound. But the paddle was gone. He turned his eyes toward the shore. Dimly through the darkness of a moonless night he saw the awful blackness of the jungle, yet it touched no responsive chord of terror within him now as it had done in the past. He did not even wonder that he was unafraid, for his mind was entirely occupied with thoughts of another's danger. Drawing himself to his knees, he leaned over the edge of the canoe and commenced to paddle vigorously with his open palm. Though it tired and hurt him, he kept assiduously at his self-imposed labor for hours. Little by little the drifting canoe moved nearer and nearer the shore. The Honorable Morrison could hear a lion roaring directly opposite him and so close that he felt he must be almost to the shore. He drew his rifle closer to his side, but he did not cease to paddle. After what seemed to the tired man an eternity of time, he felt the brush of branches against the canoe and heard the swirl of the water about them. A moment later he reached out and clutched a leafy limb. Again the lion roared, very near it seemed now, and Baines wondered if the brute could have been following along the shore waiting for him to land. He tested the strength of the limb to which he clung. It seemed strong enough to support a dozen men. Then he reached down and lifted his rifle from the bottom of the canoe, slipping the sling over his shoulder. Again he tested the branch, and then reaching upward as far as he could for a safe hold, he drew himself painfully and slowly upward until his feet swung clear of the canoe, which, released, floated silently from beneath him to be lost forever in the blackness of the dark shadows downstream. He had burned his bridges behind him. He must either climb aloft or drop back into the river, but there had been no other way. He struggled to raise one leg over the limb, but found himself scarce equal to the effort, for he was very weak. For a time he hung there feeling his strength ebbing. He knew that he must gain the branch above at once or it would be too late. Suddenly the lion roared almost in his ear. Baines glanced up. He saw two spots of flame a short distance from and above him. The lion was standing on the bank of the river glaring at him, and waiting for him. Well, thought the Honourable Morrison, let him wait. Lions can't climb trees, and if I get into this one I shall be safe enough from him. The young Englishman's feet hung almost to the surface of the water, closer than he knew, for all was pitch dark below as above him. Presently he heard a slight commotion in the river beneath him and something banged against one of his feet, followed almost instantly by a sound that he felt he could not have mistaken, the click of great jaws snapping together. "By George!" exclaimed the Honourable Morrison, aloud. "The beggar nearly got me," and immediately he struggled again to climb higher and to comparative safety, but with that final effort he knew that it was futile. Hope that had survived persistently until now began to wane. He felt his tired, numbed fingers slipping from their hold. He was dropping back into the river, into the jaws of the frightful death that awaited him there. And then he heard the leaves above him rustle to the movement of a creature among them. The branch to which he clung bent beneath an added weight, and no light weight, from the way it sagged, but still Baines clung desperately. He would not give up voluntarily either to the death above or the death below. He felt a soft, warm pad upon the fingers of one of his hands where they circled the branch to which he clung, and then something reached down out of the blackness above and dragged him up among the branches of the tree. Chapter 24. Sometimes lolling upon Tanta's back, sometimes roaming the jungle in solitude, Korak made his way slowly toward the west and south. He made but a few miles a day, for he had a whole lifetime before him and no place in particular to go. Possibly he would have moved more rapidly but for the thought which continually haunted him that each mile he traversed carried him further and further away from Miriam, no longer his Miriam, as of yore, it is true, but still as dear to him as ever. Thus he came upon the trail of the sheik's band as it travelled downriver from the point where the sheikh had captured Miriam to his own stockaded village. Korak pretty well knew who it was that had passed, for there were few in the great jungle with whom he was not familiar, though it had been years since he had come this far north. He had no particular business, however, with the old sheikh, and so he did not propose following him. The further from men he could stay the better pleased he would be. He wished that he might never see a human face again. Men always brought him sorrow and misery. The river suggested fishing, and so he dawdled upon its shores, catching fish after a fashion of his own devising and eating them raw. When night came he curled up in a great tree beside the stream, the one from which he had been fishing during the afternoon, and was soon asleep. Numa, roaring beneath him, awoke him. He was about to call out in anger to his noisy neighbor when something else caught his attention. He listened. Was there something in the tree beside himself? Yes, he heard the noise of something below him trying to clamber upward. Presently he heard the click of a crocodile's jaws in the waters beneath, and then, low but distinct, "By George! The beggar nearly got me." The voice was familiar. Korak glanced downward toward the speaker. Outlined against the faint luminosity of the water he saw the figure of a man clinging to a lower branch of the tree. Silently and swiftly the ape-man clambered downward. He felt a hand beneath his foot. He reached down and clutched the figure beneath him and dragged it up among the branches. It struggled weakly and struck at him, but Korak paid no more attention than Tanta to an ant. He lugged his burden to the higher safety and greater comfort of a broad crotch, and there he propped it in a sitting position against the bole of the tree. Numa still was roaring beneath them, doubtless in anger that he had been robbed of his prey. Korak shouted down at him, calling him, in the language of the great apes, old green-eyed eater of carrion, brother of Dango, the hyena, and other choice appellations of jungle opprobrium. The Honourable Morrison Baines, listening, felt assured that a gorilla had seized upon him. He felt for his revolver, and as he was drawing it stealthily from its holster a voice asked in perfectly good English, "Who are you?" Baines started so that he nearly fell from the branch. "My God," he exclaimed. "Are you a man?" "What did you think I was?" asked Korak. "A gorilla," replied Baines, honestly. Korak laughed. "Who are you?" he repeated. "I'm an Englishman by the name of Baines, but who the devil are you?" asked the Honourable Morrison. "They call me the Killer," replied Korak, giving the English translation of the name that Akut had given him. And then after a pause during which the Honourable Morrison attempted to pierce the darkness and catch a glimpse of the features of the strange being into whose hands he had fallen, "You are the same whom I saw kissing the girl at the edge of the great plain to the east, that time that the lion charged you?" "Yes," replied Baines. "What are you doing here?" "The girl was stolen. I am trying to rescue her." "Stolen?" The word was shot out like a bullet from a gun. "Who stole her?" "The Swede trader, Hansen," replied Baines. "Where is he?" Baines related to Korak all that had transpired since he had come upon Hansen's camp. Before he was done, the first grey dawn had relieved the darkness. Korak made the Englishman comfortable in the tree. He filled his canteen from the river and fetched him fruits to eat. Then he bid him goodbye. "I am going to the Swede's camp," he announced. "I will bring the girl back to you here." "I shall go, too, then," insisted Baines. "It is my right and my duty, for she was to have become my wife." Korak winced. "You are wounded. You could not make the trip," he said. "I can go much faster alone." "Go, then," replied Baines, "but I shall follow. It is my right and duty." "As you will," replied Korak, with a shrug. If the man wanted to be killed, it was none of his affair. He wanted to kill him himself, but for Miriam's sake he would not. If she loved him, then he must do what he could to preserve him, but he could not prevent his following him, more than to advise him against it, and this he did, earnestly. And so Korak set out rapidly toward the north, and limping slowly and painfully along, soon far to the rear, came the tired and wounded Baines. Korak had reached the river bank opposite Malbin's camp before Baines had covered 2 miles. Late in the afternoon the Englishman was still plodding wearily along, forced to stop often for rest when he heard the sound of the galloping feet of a horse behind him. Instinctively he drew into the concealing foliage of the underbrush, and a moment later a white-robed Arab dashed by. Baines did not hail the rider. He had heard of the nature of the Arabs who penetrate thus far to the south, and what he had heard had convinced him that a snake or a panther would as quickly befriend him as one of these villainous renegades from the Northland. When Abdul-Kamak had passed out of sight toward the north, Baines resumed his weary march. A half-hour later he was again surprised by the unmistakable sound of galloping horses. This time there were many. Once more he sought a hiding place, but it chanced that he was crossing a clearing which offered little opportunity for concealment. He broke into a slow trot, the best that he could do in his weakened condition, but it did not suffice to carry him to safety, and before he reached the opposite side of the clearing a band of white-robed horsemen dashed into view behind him. At sight of him they shouted in Arabic, which, of course, he could not understand, and then they closed about him, threatening and angry. Their questions were unintelligible to him, and no more could they interpret his English. At last, evidently out of patience, the leader ordered 2 of his men to seize him, which they lost no time in doing. They disarmed him and ordered him to climb to the rump of one of the horses, and then the 2 who had been detailed to guard him turned and rode back toward the south, while the others continued their pursuit of Abdul-Kamak. As Korak came out upon the bank of the river across from which he could see the camp of Malbin, he was at a loss as to how he was to cross. He could see men moving about among the huts inside the boma. Evidently Hansen was still there. Korak did not know the true identity of Miriam's abductor. How was he to cross? Not even he would dare the perils of the river, almost certain death. For a moment he thought, then wheeled and sped away into the jungle, uttering a peculiar cry, shrill and piercing. Now and again he would halt to listen as though for an answer to his weird call, then on again, deeper and deeper into the wood. At last his listening ears were rewarded by the sound they craved, the trumpeting of a bull elephant, and a few moments later Korak broke through the trees into the presence of Tanta, standing with upraised trunk, waving his great ears. "Quick, Tanta!" shouted the ape-man, and the beast swung him to his head. "Hurry!" and the mighty pachyderm lumbered off through the jungle, guided by kicking of naked heels against the sides of his head. Toward the northwest Korak guided his huge mount, until they came out upon the river a mile or more above the Swedes' camp, at a point where Korak knew that there was an elephant ford. Never pausing, the ape-man urged the beast into the river, and with trunk held high Tanta forged steadily toward the opposite bank. Once an unwary crocodile attacked him, but the sinuous trunk dove beneath the surface and grasping the amphibian about the middle dragged it to light and hurled it 100 feet downstream. And so, in safety, they made the opposite shore, Korak perched high and dry above the turgid flood. Then back toward the south Tanta moved, steadily, relentlessly, and with a swinging gait which took no heed of any obstacle other than the larger jungle trees. At times Korak was forced to abandon the broad head and take to the trees above, so close the branches raked the back of the elephant, but at last they came to the edge of the clearing where lay the camp of the renegade Swede, nor even then did they hesitate or halt. The gate lay upon the east side of the camp, facing the river. Tanta and Korak approached from the north. There was no gate there, but what cared Tanta or Korak for gates? At a word from the ape-man and raising his tender trunk high above the thorns, Tanta breasted the boma, walking through it as though it had not existed. A dozen blacks squatted before their huts looked up at the noise of his approach. With sudden howls of terror and amazement they leaped to their feet and fled for the open gates. Tanta would have pursued. He hated man, and he thought that Korak had come to hunt these, but the ape-man held him back, guiding him toward a large, canvas tent that rose in the center of the clearing. There should be the girl and her abductor. Malbin lay in a hammock beneath canopy before his tent. His wounds were painful and he had lost much blood. He was very weak. He looked up in surprise as he heard the screams of his men and saw them running toward the gate. And then from around the corner of his tent loomed a huge bulk, and Tanta, the great tusker, towered above him. Malbin's boy, feeling neither affection nor loyalty for his master, broke and ran at the first glimpse of the beast, and Malbin was left alone and helpless. The elephant stopped a couple of paces from the wounded man's hammock. Malbin cowered, moaning. He was too weak to escape. He could only lie there with staring eyes gazing in horror into the blood-rimmed, angry little orbs fixed upon him, and await his death. Then, to his astonishment, a man slid to the ground from the elephant's back. Almost at once Malbin recognized the strange figure as that of the creature who consorted with apes and baboons, the white warrior of the jungle who had freed the king baboon and led the whole angry horde of hairy devils upon him and Yen Sen. Malbin cowered still lower. "Where is the girl?" demanded Korak, in English. "What girl?" asked Malbin. "There is no girl here, only the women of my boys. Is it one of them you want?" "The white girl," replied Korak. "Do not lie to me, you lured her from her friends. You have her. Where is she?" "It was not I," cried Malbin. "It was an Englishman who hired me to steal her. He wished to take her to London with him. She was willing to go. His name is Baines. Go to him, if you want to know where the girl is." "I have just come from him," said Korak. "He sent me to you. The girl is not with him. Now stop your lying and tell me the truth. Where is she?" Korak took a threatening step toward the Swede. Malbin shrank from the anger in the other's face. "I will tell you," he cried. "Do not harm me and I will tell you all that I know. I had the girl here, but it was Baines who persuaded her to leave her friends. He had promised to marry her. He does not know who she is, but I do, and I know that there is a great reward for whoever takes her back to her people. It was the only reward I wanted. But she escaped and crossed the river in one of my canoes. I followed her, but the Sheikh was there, God knows how, and he captured her and attacked me and drove me back. Then came Baines, angry because he had lost the girl, and shot me. If you want her, go to the Sheikh and ask him for her. She has passed as his daughter since childhood. She is not the Sheikh's daughter, asked Korak. She is not, replied Malbin. Who is she then? Asked Korak. Here Malbin saw his chance. Possibly he could make use of his knowledge after all, it might even buy back his life for him. He was not so credulous as to believe that this savage ape-man would have any compunctions about slaying him. When you find her I will tell you, he said, if you will promise to spare my life and divide the reward with me. If you kill me you will never know, for only the Sheikh knows and he will never tell. The girl herself is ignorant of her origin. If you have told me the truth I will spare you, said Korak. I shall go now to the Sheikh's village and if the girl is not there I shall return and slay you. As for the other information you have, if the girl wants it when we have found her we will find a way to purchase it from you. The look in the killer's eyes and his emphasis of the word purchase were none too reassuring to Malbin. Evidently, unless he found means to escape, this devil would have both his secret and his life before he was done with him. He wished he would be gone and take his evil-eyed companion away with him. The swaying bulk towering high above him, and the ugly little eyes of the elephant watching his every move made Malbin nervous. Korak stepped into the Swede's tent to assure himself that Mariam was not hid there. As he disappeared from view Tanta, his eyes still fixed upon Malbin, took a step nearer the man. An elephant's eyesight is none too good, but the great tusker evidently had harbored suspicions of this yellow-bearded white man from the first. Now he advanced his snake-like trunk toward the Swede, who shrank still deeper into his hammock. The sensitive member felt and smelled back and forth along the body of the terrified Malbin. Tanta uttered a low, rumbling sound. His little eyes blazed. At last he had recognized the creature who had killed his mate long years before. Tanta, the elephant, never forgets and never forgives. Malbin saw in the demoniacal visage above him the murderous purpose of the beast. He shrieked aloud to Korak. Help! Help! The devil is going to kill me. Korak ran from the tent just in time to see the enraged elephant's trunk encircle the beast's victim, and then hammock, canopy and man were swung high over Tanta's head. Korak leaped before the animal, commanding him to put down his prey unharmed, but as well might he have ordered the eternal river to reverse its course. Tanta wheeled around like a cat, hurled Malbin to the earth and kneeled upon him with the quickness of a cat. Then he gored the prostrate thing through and through with his mighty tusks, trumpeting and roaring in his rage, and at last, convinced that no slightest spark of life remained in the crushed and lacerated flesh, he lifted the shapeless clay that had been Sven Malbin far aloft and hurled the bloody mass, still entangled in canopy and hammock, over the boma and out into the jungle. Korak stood looking sorrowfully on at the tragedy he gladly would have averted. He had no love for the Swede, in fact only hatred, but he would have preserved the man for the sake of the secret he possessed. Now that secret was gone forever unless the Sheikh could be made to divulge it, but in that possibility Korak placed little faith. The ape-man, as unafraid of the mighty Tanta as though he had not just witnessed his shocking murder of a human being, signaled the beast to approach and lift him to its head, and Tanta came as he was bid, docile as a kitten, and hoisted the killer tenderly aloft. From the safety of their hiding places in the jungle Malbin's boys had witnessed the killing of their master, and now, with wide, frightened eyes, they saw the strange white warrior, mounted upon the head of his ferocious charger, disappear into the jungle at the point from which he had emerged upon their terrified vision. Chapter 25. The Sheikh glowered at the prisoner which his two men brought back to him from the north. He had sent the party after Abdul-Kamak, and he was wroth that instead of his erstwhile lieutenant they had sent back a wounded and useless Englishman. Why had they not dispatched him where they had found him? He was some penniless beggar of a trader who had wandered from his own district and became lost. He was worthless. The Sheikh scowled terribly upon him. "Who are you?" he asked in French. "I am the Honourable Morrison Baines of London," replied his prisoner. The title sounded promising, and at once the wily old robber had visions of ransom. His intentions, if not his attitude toward the prisoner, underwent a change. He would investigate further. "What were you doing poaching in my country?" growled he. "I was not aware that you owned Africa," replied the Honourable Morrison. "I was searching for a young woman who had been abducted from the home of a friend. The abductor wounded me and I drifted downriver in a canoe. I was on my way back to his camp when your men seized me." "A young woman?" asked the Sheikh. "Is that she?" and he pointed to his left over toward a clump of bushes near the stockade. Baines looked in the direction indicated and his eyes went wide, for there, sitting cross-legged upon the ground, her back toward them, was Miriam. "Miriam!" he shouted, starting toward her, but one of his guards grasped his arm and jerked him back. The girl leaped to her feet and turned toward him as she heard her name. "Morrison!" she cried. "Be still, and stay where you are," snapped the Sheikh, and then to Baines. "So you are the dog of a Christian who stole my daughter from me." "Your daughter?" ejaculated Baines. "She is your daughter?" "She is my daughter," growled the Arab, "and she is not for any unbeliever. You have earned death, Englishman, but if you can pay for your life I will give it to you." Baines' eyes were still wide at the unexpected sight of Miriam here in the camp of the Arab when he had thought her in Hanson's power. What had happened? How had she escaped the Swede? Had the Arab taken her by force from him, or had she escaped and come voluntarily back to the protection of the man who called her daughter? He would have given much for a word with her. If she was safe here he might only harm her by antagonizing the Arab in an attempt to take her away and return her to her English friends. No longer did the Honourable Morrison harbour thoughts of luring the girl to London. "Well?" asked the Sheikh. "Oh," exclaimed Baines, "I beg your pardon, I was thinking of something else." "Why yes, of course, glad to pay, I'm sure. How much do you think I'm worth?" The Sheikh named a sum that was rather less exorbitant than the Honourable Morrison had anticipated. The latter nodded his head in token of his entire willingness to pay. He would have promised a sum far beyond his resources just as readily, for he had no intention of paying anything. His one reason for seeming to comply with the Sheikh's demands was that the wait for the coming of the ransom money would give him the time and the opportunity to free Miriam if he found that she wished to be freed. The Arab's statement that he was her father naturally raised the question in the Honourable Morrison's mind as to precisely what the girl's attitude toward escape might be. It seemed, of course, preposterous that this fair and beautiful young woman should prefer to remain in the filthy dour of an illiterate old Arab rather than return to the comforts, luxuries, and congenial associations of the hospitable African bungalow from which the Honourable Morrison had tricked her. The man flushed at the thought of his duplicity which these recollections aroused, thoughts which were interrupted by the Sheikh, who instructed the Honourable Morrison to write a letter to the British consul at Algiers, dictating the exact phraseology of it with a fluency that indicated to his captive that this was not the first time the old rascal had had occasion to negotiate with English relatives for the ransom of a kinsman. Baines demurred when he saw that the letter was addressed to the consul at Algiers, saying that it would require the better part of a year to get the money back to him, but the Sheikh would not listen to Baines' plan to send a messenger directly to the nearest coast town, and from there communicate with the nearest cable station, sending the Honourable Morrison's request for funds straight to his own solicitors. No, the Sheikh was cautious and wary. He knew his own plan had worked well in the past. In the other were too many untried elements. He was in no hurry for the money. He could wait a year, or 2 years if necessary, but it should not require over 6 months. He turned to one of the Arabs who had been standing behind him and gave the fellow instructions in relation to the prisoner. Baines could not understand the words, spoken in Arabic, but the jerk of the thumb toward him showed that he was the subject of conversation. The Arab addressed by the Sheikh bowed to his master and beckoned Baines to follow him. The Englishman looked toward the Sheikh for confirmation. The latter nodded impatiently, and the Honourable Morrison rose and followed his guide toward a native hut which lay close beside one of the outside goatskin tents. In the dark, stifling interior his guard led him, then stepped to the doorway and called to a couple of black boys squatting before their own huts. They came promptly and in accordance with the Arab's instructions bound Baines' wrists and ankles securely. The Englishman objected strenuously, but as neither the blacks nor the Arab could understand a word he said, his pleas were wasted. Having bound him, they left the hut. The Honourable Morrison lay for a long time contemplating the frightful future which awaited him during the long months which must intervene before his friends learned of his predicament and could get succor to him. Now he hoped that they would send the ransom. He would gladly pay all that he was worth to be out of this hole. At first it had been his intention to cable his solicitors to send no money but to communicate with the British West African authorities and have an expedition sent to his aid. His patrician nose wrinkled in disgust as his nostrils were assailed by the awful stench of the hut. The nasty grasses upon which he lay exuded the effluvium of sweaty bodies, of decayed animal matter and of offal. But worse was yet to come. He had lain in the uncomfortable position in which they had thrown him but for a few minutes when he became distinctly conscious of an acute itching sensation upon his hands, his neck and scalp. He wriggled to a sitting posture, horrified and disgusted. The itching rapidly extended to other parts of his body. It was torture, and his hands were bound securely at his back. He tugged and pulled at his bonds until he was exhausted, but not entirely without hope, for he was sure that he was working enough slack out of the knot to eventually permit of his withdrawing one of his hands. Night came. They brought him neither food nor drink. He wondered if they expected him to live on nothing for a year. The bites of the vermin grew less annoying though not less numerous. The Honourable Morrison saw a ray of hope in this indication of future immunity through inoculation. He still worked weakly at his bonds, and then the rats came. If the vermin were disgusting, the rats were terrifying. They scurried over his body, squealing and fighting. Finally one commenced to chew at one of his ears. With an oath, the Honourable Morrison struggled to a sitting posture. The rats retreated. He worked his legs beneath him and came to his knees, and then, by superhuman effort, rose to his feet. There he stood, reeling drunkenly, dripping with cold sweat. God, he muttered, what have I done to deserve? He paused. What had he done? He thought of the girl in another tent in that accursed village. He was getting his deserts. He set his jaws firmly with the realization. He would never complain again. At that moment he became aware of voices raised angrily in the goatskin tent close beside the hut in which he lay. One of them was a woman's. Could it be Miriam's? The language was probably Arabic. He could not understand a word of it, but the tones were hers. He tried to think of some way of attracting her attention to his near presence. If she could remove his bonds, they might escape together if she wished to escape. That thought bothered him. He was not sure of her status in the village. If she were the petted child of the powerful sheikh, then she would probably not care to escape. He must know, definitely. At the bungalow he had often heard Miriam sing God Save the King, as my dear accompanied her on the piano. Raising his voice he now hummed the tune. Immediately he heard Miriam's voice from the tent. She spoke rapidly. "Goodbye, Morrison," she cried. "If God is good, I shall be dead before morning, for if I still live I shall be worse than dead after tonight." Then he heard an angry exclamation in a man's voice, followed by the sounds of a scuffle. Baines went white with horror. He struggled frantically again with his bonds. They were giving. A moment later one hand was free. It was but the work of an instant then to loose the other. Stooping, he untied the rope from his ankles, then he straightened and started for the hut doorway bent on reaching Miriam's side. As he stepped out into the night, the figure of a huge black rose and barred his progress. When speed was required of him, Korak depended upon no other muscles than his own, and so it was that the moment Tanta had landed him safely upon the same side of the river as lay the village of the Sheikh, the ape-man deserted his bulky comrade and took to the trees in a rapid race toward the south and the spot where the Swede had told him Miriam might be. It was dark when he came to the palisade, strengthened considerably since the day that he had rescued Miriam from her pitiful life within its cruel confines. No longer did the giant tree spread its branches above the wooden rampart, but ordinary man-made defenses were scarce considered obstacles by Korak. Loosening the rope at his waist, he tossed the noose over one of the sharpened posts that composed the palisade. A moment later his eyes were above the level of the obstacle, taking in all within their range beyond. There was no one in sight close by, and Korak drew himself to the top and dropped lightly to the ground within the enclosure. Then he commenced his stealthy search of the village. First toward the Arab tents he made his way, sniffing and listening. He passed behind them, searching for some sign of Miriam. Not even the wild Arab curs heard his passage, so silently he went, a shadow passing through shadows. The odor of tobacco told him that the Arabs were smoking before their tents. The sound of laughter fell upon his ears, and then from the opposite side of the village came the notes of a once familiar tune, God Save the King. Korak halted in perplexity. Who might it be? The tones were those of a man. He recalled the young Englishman he had left on the river trail and who had disappeared before he returned. A moment later there came to him a woman's voice in reply. It was Miriam's, and the killer, quickened into action, slunk rapidly in the direction of these two voices. The evening meal over, Miriam had gone to her pallet in the women's quarters of the Sheikh's tent, a little corner screened off in the rear by a couple of priceless Persian rugs to form a partition. In these quarters she had dwelt with Mabunu alone, for the Sheikh had no wives. Nor were conditions altered now after the years of her absence. She and Mabunu were alone in the women's quarters. Presently the Sheikh came and parted the rugs. He glared through the dim light of the interior. Miriam, he called. Come hither. The girl arose and came into the front of the tent. There the light of a fire illuminated the interior. She saw Ali Ben Khaden, the Sheikh's half-brother, squatted upon a rug, smoking. The Sheikh was standing. The Sheikh and Ali Ben Khaden had had the same father, but Ali Ben Khaden's mother had been a slave, a West Coast negress. Ali Ben Khaden was old and hideous and almost black. His nose and part of one cheek were eaten away by disease. He looked up and grinned as Miriam entered. The Sheikh jerked his thumb toward Ali Ben Khaden and addressed Miriam. I am getting old, he said, I shall not live much longer. Therefore I have given you to Ali Ben Khaden, my brother. That was all. Ali Ben Khaden rose and came toward her. Miriam shrank back, horrified. The man seized her wrist. Come, he commanded, and dragged her from the Sheikh's tent and to his own. After they had gone the Sheikh chuckled. When I send her north in a few months, he soliloquized, they will know the reward for slaying the son of the sister of Amor Ben Khater. And in Ali Ben Khaden's tent Miriam pleaded and threatened, but all to no avail. The hideous old half-caste spoke soft words at first, but when Miriam loosed upon him the vials of her horror and loathing he became enraged, and rushing upon her seized her in his arms. Twice she tore away from him, and in one of the intervals during which she managed to elude him she heard Bain's voice humming the tune that she knew was meant for her ears. At her reply Ali Ben Khaden rushed upon her once again. This time he dragged her back into the rear apartment of his tent where three negresses looked up in stolid indifference to the tragedy being enacted before them. As the Honourable Morrison saw his way blocked by the huge frame of the giant black, his disappointment and rage filled him with a bestial fury that transformed him into a savage beast. With an oath he leaped upon the man before him, the momentum of his body hurling the black to the ground. There they fought, the black to draw his knife, the white to choke the life from the black. Bane's fingers shut off the cry for help that the other would have been glad to voice, but presently the Negro succeeded in drawing his weapon, and an instant later Baines felt the sharp steel in his shoulder. Again and again the weapon fell. The white man removed one hand from its choking grip upon the black throat. He felt around upon the ground beside him searching for some missile, and at last his fingers touched a stone and closed upon it. Raising it above his antagonist's head, the Honorable Morrison drove home a terrific blow. Instantly the black relaxed, stunned. Twice more Baines struck him. Then he leaped to his feet and ran for the goatskin tent from which he had heard the voice of Miriam in distress. But before him was another. Naked but for his leopard skin and his loincloth, Korak, the killer, slunk into the shadows at the back of Ali Ben Khaden's tent. The half-caste had just dragged Miriam into the rear chamber as Korak's sharp knife slit a 6-foot opening in the tent wall, and Korak, tall and mighty, sprang through upon the astonished visions of the inmates. Miriam saw and recognized him the instant that he entered the apartment. Her heart leaped in pride and joy at the sight of the noble figure for which it had hungered for so long. "Korak," she cried. "Miriam." He uttered the single word as he hurled himself upon the astonished Ali Ben Khaden. The three negresses leaped from their sleeping mats, screaming. Miriam tried to prevent them from escaping, but before she could succeed the terrified blacks had darted through the hole in the tent wall made by Korak's knife, and were gone screaming through the village. The killer's fingers closed once upon the throat of the hideous Ali. Once his knife plunged into the putrid heart, and Ali Ben Khaden lay dead upon the floor of his tent. Korak turned toward Miriam, and at the same moment a bloody and disheveled apparition leaped into the apartment. "Morrison!" cried the girl. Korak turned and looked at the newcomer. He had been about to take Miriam in his arms, forgetful of all that might have transpired since last he had seen her. Then the coming of the young Englishman recalled the scene he had witnessed in the little clearing, and a wave of misery swept over the ape man. Already from without came the sounds of the alarm that the three negresses had started. Men were running toward the tent of Ali Ben Khaden. There was no time to be lost. "Quick!" cried Korak, turning toward Baines, who had scarce yet realized whether he was facing a friend or foe. "Take her to the palisade, following the rear of the tents. Here is my rope. With it you can scale the wall and make your escape." "But you, Korak," cried Miriam. "I will remain," replied the ape man. "I have business with the sheikh." Miriam would have demurred, but the killer seized them both by the shoulders and hustled them through the slit wall and out into the shadows beyond. "Now run for it," he admonished, and turned to meet and hold those who were pouring into the tent from the front. The ape man fought well, fought as he had never fought before, but the odds were too great for victory, though he won that which he most craved, time for the Englishman to escape with Miriam. Then he was overwhelmed by numbers, and a few minutes later, bound and guarded, he was carried to the sheikh's tent. The old men eyed him in silence for a long time. He was trying to fix in his own mind some form of torture that would gratify his rage and hatred toward this creature who twice had been the means of his losing possession of Miriam. The killing of Ali Ben Khaden caused him little anger, always had he hated the hideous son of his father's hideous slave. The blow that this naked white warrior had once struck him added fuel to his rage. He could think of nothing adequate to the creature's offense. And as he sat there looking upon Korak, the silence was broken by the trumpeting of an elephant in the jungle beyond the palisade. A half-smile touched Korak's lips. He turned his head a trifle in the direction from which the sound had come, and then there broke from his lips a low, weird call. One of the blacks guarding him struck him across the mouth with the haft of his spear, but none there knew the significance of his cry. In the jungle Tanta cocked his ears as the sound of Korak's voice fell upon them. He approached the palisade and lifting his trunk above it, sniffed. Then he placed his head against the wooden logs and pushed, but the palisade was strong and only gave a little to the pressure. In the sheik's tent the sheikh rose at last, and, pointing toward the bound captive, turned to one of his lieutenants. "Burn him," he commanded. "At once. The stake is set." The guard pushed Korak from the sheik's presence. They dragged him to the open space in the center of the village, where a high stake was set in the ground. It had not been intended for burnings, but offered a convenient place to tie up refractory slaves that they might be beaten oft-times until death relieved their agonies. To this stake they bound Korak. Then they brought brush and piled about him, and the sheikh came and stood by that he might watch the agonies of his victim. But Korak did not wince even after they had fetched a brand and the flames had shot up among the dry tinder. Once, then, he raised his voice in the low call that he had given in the sheik's tent, and now, from beyond the palisade, came again the trumpeting of an elephant. Old Tanta had been pushing at the palisade in vain. The sound of Korak's voice calling him, and the scent of man, his enemy, filled the great beast with rage and resentment against the dumb barrier that held him back. He wheeled and shuffled back a dozen paces, then he turned, lifted his trunk and gave voice to a mighty roaring, trumpet call of anger, lowered his head and charged like a huge battering ram of flesh and bone and muscle straight for the mighty barrier. The palisade sagged and splintered to the impact, and through the breach rushed the infuriated bull. Korak heard the sounds that the others heard, and he interpreted them as the others did not. The flames were creeping closer to him when one of the blacks, hearing a noise behind him, turned to see the enormous bulk of Tanta lumbering toward them. The man screamed and fled, and then the bull elephant was among them, tossing Negroes and Arabs to right and left as he tore through the flames he feared to the side of the comrade he loved. The sheikh, calling orders to his followers, ran to his tent to get his rifle. Tanta wrapped his trunk about the body of Korak and the stake to which it was bound, and tore it from the ground. The flames were searing his sensitive hide, sensitive for all its thickness, so that in his frenzy to both rescue his friend and escape the hated fire he had all but crushed the life from the ape-man. Lifting his burden high above his head, the giant beast wheeled and raced for the breach that he had just made in the palisade. The sheikh, rifle in hand, rushed from his tent directly into the path of the maddened brute. He raised his weapon and fired once. The bullet missed its mark, and Tanta was upon him, crushing him beneath those gigantic feet as he raced over him as you and I might crush out the life of an ant that chanced to be in our pathway. And then, bearing his burden carefully, Tanta, the elephant, entered the blackness of the jungle. Chapter 26. Miriam, dazed by the unexpected sight of Korak, whom she had long given up as dead, permitted herself to be led away by Baines. Among the tents he guided her safely to the palisade, and there, following Korak's instructions, the Englishman pitched a noose over the top of one of the upright logs that formed the barrier. With difficulty he reached the top and then lowered his hand to assist Miriam to his side. "Come," he whispered. "We must hurry." And then, as though she had awakened from a sleep, Miriam came to herself. Back there, fighting her enemies, alone, was Korak, her Korak. Her place was by his side, fighting with him and for him. She glanced up at Baines. "Go," she called. "Make your way back to Bwana and bring help. My place is here. You can do no good remaining. Get away while you can and bring the big Bwana back with you." Silently the Honourable Morrison Baines slid to the ground inside the palisade to Miriam's side. "It was only for you that I left him," he said, nodding toward the tents they had just left. "I knew that he could hold them longer than I and give you a chance to escape that I might not be able to have given you. It was I though who should have remained. I heard you call him Korak and so I know now who he is. He befriended you. I would have wronged you." "No, don't interrupt. I'm going to tell you the truth now and let you know just what a beast I have been. I planned to take you to London, as you know, but I did not plan to marry you. Yes, shrink from me, I deserve it. I deserve your contempt and loathing, but I didn't know then what love was. Since I have learned that I have learned something else, what a cad and what a coward I have been all my life. I looked down upon those whom I considered my social inferiors. I did not think you good enough to bear my name. Since Hansen tricked me and took you for himself, I have been through hell, but it has made a man of me, though too late. Now I can come to you with an offer of honest love, which will realize the honor of having such as you share my name with me. For a moment Miriam was silent, buried in thought. Her first question seemed irrelevant. How did you happen to be in this village? She asked. He told her all that had transpired since the black had told him of Hansen's duplicity. You say that you are a coward, she said, and yet you have done all this to save me. The courage that it must have taken to tell me the things that you told me but a moment since, while courage of a different sort, proves that you are no moral coward, and the other proves that you are not a physical coward. I could not love a coward. You mean that you love me, he gasped in astonishment, taking a step toward her as though to gather her into his arms, but she placed her hand against him and pushed him gently away, as much as to say, not yet. What she did mean she scarcely knew. She thought that she loved him, of that there can be no question, nor did she think that love for this young Englishman was disloyalty to Korak, for her love for Korak was undiminished, the love of a sister for an indulgent brother. As they stood there for the moment of their conversation, the sounds of tumult in the village subsided. They have killed him, whispered Miriam. The statement brought Baines to a realization of the cause of their return. Wait here, he said. I will go and see. If he is dead we can do him no good. If he lives I will do my best to free him. We will go together, replied Miriam. Come. And she led the way back toward the tent in which they last had seen Korak. As they went they were often forced to throw themselves to the ground in the shadow of a tent or hut, for people were passing hurriedly to and fro now, the whole village was aroused and moving about. The return to the tent of Ali Ben Khaden took much longer than had their swift flight to the palisade. Cautiously they crept to the slit that Korak's knife had made in the rear wall. Miriam peered within, the rear apartment was empty. She crawled through the aperture, Baines at her heels, and then silently crossed the space to the rugs that partitioned the tent into two rooms. Parting the hangings, Miriam looked into the front room. It, too, was deserted. She crossed to the door of the tent and looked out. Then she gave a little gasp of horror. Baines at her shoulder looked past her to the sight that had startled her, and he, too, exclaimed, but his was an oath of anger. 100 feet away they saw Korak bound to a stake, the brush piled about him already alight. The Englishman pushed Miriam to one side and started to run for the doomed man. What he could do in the face of scores of hostile blacks and Arabs he did not stop to consider. At the same instant Hunter broke through the palisade and charged the group. In the face of the maddened beast the crowd turned and fled, carrying Baines backward with them. In a moment it was all over, and the elephant had disappeared with his prize, but pandemonium reigned throughout the village. Men, women, and children ran helter-skelter for safety. Curs fled, yelping. The horses and camels and donkeys, terrorized by the trumpeting of the pachyderm, kicked and pulled at their tethers. A dozen or more broke loose, and it was the galloping of these past him that brought a sudden idea into Baines' head. He turned to search for Miriam only to find her at his elbow. The horses, he cried. If we can get a couple of them. Filled with the idea, Miriam led him to the far end of the village. Loosen 2 of them, she said, and lead them back into the shadows behind those huts. I know where there are saddles. I will bring them and the bridles, and before he could stop her she was gone. Baines quickly untied 2 of the restive animals and led them to the point designated by Miriam. Here he waited impatiently for what seemed an hour, but was, in reality, but a few minutes. Then he saw the girl approaching beneath the burden of 2 saddles. Quickly they placed these upon the horses. They could see by the light of the torture fire that still burned that the blacks and Arabs were recovering from their panic. Men were running about gathering in the loose stock, and 2 or 3 were already leading their captives back to the end of the village where Miriam and Baines were busy with the trappings of their mounts. Now the girl flung herself into the saddle. "Hurry," she whispered. "We shall have to run for it." Right through the gap that Tanta made, and as she saw Baines swing his leg over the back of his horse, she shook the reins free over her mount's neck. With a lunge, the nervous beast leaped forward. The shortest path led straight through the center of the village, and this Miriam took. Baines was close behind her, their horses running at full speed. So sudden and impetuous was their dash for escape that it carried them halfway across the village before the surprised inhabitants were aware of what was happening. Then an Arab recognized them, and, with a cry of alarm, raised his rifle and fired. The shot was a signal for a volley, and amid the rattle of musketry Miriam and Baines leaped their flying mounts through the breach in the palisade and were gone up the well-worn trail toward the north. And Korak? Tanta carried him deep into the jungle, nor paused until no sound from the distant village reached his keen ears. Then he laid his burden gently down. Korak struggled to free himself from his bonds, but even his great strength was unable to cope with the many strands of hard-knotted cord that bound him. While he lay there, working and resting by turns, the elephant stood guard above him, nor was their jungle enemy with the hardihood to tempt the sudden death that lay in that mighty bulk. Dawn came, and still Korak was no nearer freedom than before. He commenced to believe that he should die there of thirst and starvation with plenty all about him, for he knew that Tanta could not unloose the knots that held him. And while he struggled through the night with his bonds, Baines and Miriam were riding rapidly northward along the river. The girl had assured Baines that Korak was safe in the jungle with Tanta. It had not occurred to her that the ape-man might not be able to burst his bonds. Baines had been wounded by a shot from the rifle of one of the Arabs, and the girl wanted to get him back to Bwana's home, where he could be properly cared for. "Then," she said, "I shall get Bwana to come with me and search for Korak. He must come and live with us." All night they rode, and the day was still young when they came suddenly upon a party hurrying southward. It was Bwana himself and his sleek, black warriors. At sight of Baines the big Englishman's brows contracted in a scowl, but he waited to hear Miriam's story before giving vent to the long anger in his breast. When she had finished he seemed to have forgotten Baines. His thoughts were occupied with another subject. "You say that you found Korak?" he asked. "You really saw him?" "Yes," replied Miriam, "as plainly as I see you, and I want you to come with me, Bwana, and help me find him again." "Did you see him?" He turned toward the Honorable Morrison. "Yes, sir," replied Baines, very plainly. "What sort of appearing man is he?" continued Bwana. "About how old, should you say?" "I should say he was an Englishman, about my own age," replied Baines, "though he might be older. He is remarkably muscled, and exceedingly tanned. His eyes and hair, did you notice them?" Bwana spoke rapidly, almost excitedly. It was Miriam who answered him. "Korak's hair is black and his eyes are grey," she said. Bwana turned to his headman. "Take Miss Miriam and Mr. Baines home," he said. "I am going into the jungle." "Let me go with you, Bwana," cried Miriam. "You are going to search for Korak. Let me go, too." Bwana turned sadly but firmly upon the girl. "Your place," he said, "is beside the man you love." Then he motioned to his headman to take his horse and commence the return journey to the farm. Miriam slowly mounted the tired Arab that had brought her from the village of the Sheikh. A litter was rigged for the now feverish Baines, and the little cavalcade was soon slowly winding off along the river trail. Bwana stood watching them until they were out of sight. Not once had Miriam turned her eyes backward. She rode with bowed head and drooping shoulders. Bwana sighed. He loved the little Arab girl as he might have loved an own daughter. He realized that Baines had redeemed himself, and so he could interpose no objections now if Miriam really loved the man, but, somehow, someway, Bwana could not convince himself that the Honourable Morrison was worthy of his little Miriam. Slowly he turned toward a nearby tree. Leaping upward he caught a lower branch and drew himself up among the branches. His movements were cat-like and agile. High into the trees he made his way and there commenced to divest himself of his clothing. From the game bag slung across one shoulder he drew a long strip of doe skin, a neatly coiled rope, and a wicked-looking knife. The doe skin he fashioned into a loincloth, the rope he looped over one shoulder, and the knife he thrust into the belt formed by his G-string. When he stood erect, his head thrown back and his great chest expanded, a grim smile touched his lips for a moment. His nostrils dilated as he sniffed the jungle odors. His grey eyes narrowed. He crouched and leaped to a lower limb and was away through the trees toward the southeast, bearing away from the river. He moved swiftly, stopping only occasionally to raise his voice in a weird and piercing scream, and to listen for a moment after for a reply. He had traveled thus for several hours when, ahead of him and a little to his left, he heard, far off in the jungle, a faint response, the cry of a bull ape answering his cry. His nerves tingled and his eyes lighted as the sound fell upon his ears. Again he voiced his hideous call, and sped forward in the new direction. Korak, finally becoming convinced that he must die if he remained where he was, waiting for the succor that could not come, spoke to Tanta in the strange tongue that the great beast understood. He commanded the elephant to lift him and carry him toward the northeast. There, recently, Korak had seen both white men and black. If he could come upon one of the latter, it would be a simple matter to command Tanta to capture the fellow, and then Korak could get him to release him from the stake. It was worth trying at least, better than lying there in the jungle until he died. As Tanta bore him along through the forest, Korak called aloud now and then in the hope of attracting Akut's band of anthropoids, whose wanderings often brought them into their neighborhood. Akut, he thought, might possibly be able to negotiate the knots. He had done so upon that other occasion when the Russian had bound Korak years before, and Akut, to the south of him, heard his calls faintly, and came. There was another who heard them, too. After Bwana had left his party, sending them back toward the farm, Miriam had ridden for a short distance with bowed head. What thoughts passed through that active brain, who may say? Presently she seemed to come to a decision. She called the headman to her side. "I am going back with Bwana," she announced. The black shook his head. "No," he announced. "Bwana says I take you home. So I take you home." "You refuse to let me go?" asked the girl. The black nodded, and fell to the rear where he might better watch her. Miriam half smiled. Presently her horse passed beneath a low-hanging branch, and the black headman found himself gazing at the girl's empty saddle. He ran forward to the tree into which she had disappeared. He could see nothing of her. He called, but there was no response, unless it might have been a low, taunting laugh far to the right. He sent his men into the jungle to search for her, but they came back empty-handed. After a while he resumed his march toward the farm, for Baines, by this time, was delirious with fever. Miriam raced straight back toward the point she imagined Tanta would make for, a point where she knew the elephants often gathered deep in the forest due east of the sheik's village. She moved silently and swiftly. From her mind she had expunged all thoughts other than that she must reach Korak and bring him back with her. It was her place to do that. Then, too, had come the tantalizing fear that all might not be well with him. She upbraided herself for not thinking of that before, of letting her desire to get the wounded Morrison back to the bungalow blind her to the possibilities of Korak's need for her. She had been traveling rapidly for several hours without rest when she heard ahead of her the familiar cry of a great ape calling to his kind. She did not reply, only increased her speed until she almost flew. Now there came to her sensitive nostrils the scent of Tanta, and she knew that she was on the right trail and close to him she sought. She did not call out because she wished to surprise him, and presently she did, breaking into sight of them as the great elephant shuffled ahead, balancing the man and the heavy stake upon his head, holding them there with his up-curled trunk. "Korak!" cried Miriam from the foliage above him. Instantly the bull swung about, lowered his burden to the ground and, trumpeting savagely, prepared to defend his comrade. The ape-man, recognizing the girl's voice, felt a sudden lump in his throat. "Miriam," he called back to her. Happily the girl clambered to the ground and ran forward to release Korak, but Tanta lowered his head ominously and trumpeted a warning. "Go back! Go back!" cried Korak. "He will kill you." Miriam paused. "Tanta," she called to the huge brute. "Don't you remember me? I am little Miriam. I used to ride on your broad back," but the bull only rumbled in his throat and shook his tusks in angry defiance. Then Korak tried to placate him. Tried to order him away, that the girl might approach and release him, but Tanta would not go. He saw in every human being other than Korak an enemy. He thought the girl bent upon harming his friend and he would take no chances. For an hour the girl and the man tried to find some means whereby they might circumvent the beast's ill-directed guardianship, but all to no avail. Tanta stood his ground in grim determination to let no one approach Korak. Presently the man hit upon a scheme. "Pretend to go away," he called to the girl. "Keep downwind from us so that Tanta won't get your scent, then follow us. After a while I'll have him put me down, and find some pretext for sending him away. While he is gone you can slip up and cut my bonds. Have you a knife?" "Yes, I have a knife," she replied. "I'll go now. I think we may be able to fool him, but don't be too sure." Tanta invented cunning. Korak smiled, for he knew that the girl was right. Presently she had disappeared. The elephant listened, and raised his trunk to catch her scent. Korak commanded him to raise him to his head once more and proceed upon their way. After a moment's hesitation he did as he was bid. It was then that Korak heard the distant call of an ape. "Akut," he thought. Good. Tanta knew Akut well. He would let him approach. Raising his voice, Korak replied to the call of the ape, but he let Tanta move off with him through the jungle. It would do no harm to try the other plan. They had come to a clearing and plainly Korak smelled water. Here was a good place and a good excuse. He ordered Tanta to lay him down, and go and fetch him water in his trunk. The big beast deposited him upon the grass in the center of the clearing, then he stood with cocked ears and attentive trunk, searching for the slightest indication of danger. There seemed to be none, and he moved away in the direction of the little brook that Korak knew was some 200 or 300 yards away. The ape-man could scarce help smiling as he thought how cleverly he had tricked his friend, but well as he knew Tanta, he little guessed the guile of his cunning brain. The animal ambled off across the clearing and disappeared in the jungle beyond in the direction of the stream, but scarce had his great bulk been screened by the dense foliage than he wheeled about and came cautiously back to the edge of the clearing where he could see without being seen. Tanta, by nature, is suspicious. Now he still feared the return of the Shitamangani who had attempted to attack his Korak. He would just stand there for a moment and assure himself that all was well before he continued on toward the water. Ah! It was well that he did. There she was now, dropping from the branches of a tree across the clearing and running swiftly toward the ape-man. Tanta waited. He would let her reach Korak before he charged, that would ensure that she had no chance of escape. His little eyes blazed savagely. His tail was elevated stiffly. He could scarce restrain a desire to trumpet forth his rage to the world. Miriam was almost at Korak's side when Tanta saw the long knife in her hand, and then he broke forth from the jungle, bellowing horribly, and charged down upon the frail girl. Chapter 27. Korak screamed commands to his huge protector, in an effort to halt him, but all to no avail. Miriam raced toward the bordering trees with all the speed that lay in her swift, little feet, but Tanta, for all his huge bulk, drove down upon her with the rapidity of an express train. Korak lay where he could see the whole frightful tragedy. The cold sweat broke out upon his body. His heart seemed to have stopped its beating. Miriam might reach the trees before Tanta overtook her, but even her agility would not carry her beyond the reach of that relentless trunk. She would be dragged down and tossed. Korak could picture the whole frightful scene. Then Tanta would follow her up, goring the frail, little body with his relentless tusks, or trampling it into an unrecognizable mass beneath his ponderous feet. He was almost upon her now. Korak wanted to close his eyes, but could not. His throat was dry and parched. Never in all his savage existence had he suffered such blighting terror, never before had he known what terror meant. A dozen more strides and the brute would seize her. What was that? Korak's eyes started from their sockets. A strange figure had leaped from the tree, the shade of which Miriam already had reached, leaped beyond the girl straight into the path of the charging elephant. It was a naked white giant. Across his shoulder a coil of rope was looped. In the band of his G-string was a hunting knife. Otherwise he was unarmed. With naked hands he faced the maddening Tanta. A sharp command broke from the stranger's lips, the great beast halted in his tracks, and Miriam swung herself upward into the tree to safety. Korak breathed a sigh of relief not unmixed with wonder. He fastened his eyes upon the face of Miriam's deliverer, and as recognition slowly filtered into his understanding they went wide in incredulity and surprise. Tanta, still rumbling angrily, stood swaying to and fro close before the giant white man. Then the latter stepped straight beneath the upraised trunk and spoke a low word of command. The great beast ceased his muttering. The savage light died from his eyes, and as the stranger stepped forward toward Korak, Tanta trailed docilely at his heels. Miriam was watching, too, and wondering. Suddenly the man turned toward her as though recollecting her presence after a moment of forgetfulness. "Come, Miriam," he called, and then she recognized him with a startled, "Bwana." Quickly the girl dropped from the tree and ran to his side. Tanta cocked a questioning eye at the white giant, but receiving a warning word let Miriam approach. Together the two walked to where Korak lay, his eyes wide with wonder and filled with a pathetic appeal for forgiveness, and, mayhap, a glad thankfulness for the miracle that had brought these two of all others to his side. "Jack," cried the white giant, kneeling at the ape-man's side. "Father," came chokingly from the killer's lips. "Thank God that it was you. No one else in all the jungle could have stopped Tanta." Quickly the man cut the bonds that held Korak, and as the youth leaped to his feet and threw his arms about his father, the older man turned toward Miriam. "I thought," he said, sternly, "that I told you to return to the farm." Korak was looking at them wonderingly. In his heart was a great yearning to take the girl in his arms, but in time he remembered the other, the dapper young English gentleman, and that he was but a savage, uncouth ape-man. Miriam looked up pleadingly into Bwana's eyes. "You told me," she said, in a very small voice, "that my place was beside the man I loved," and she turned her eyes toward Korak all filled with the wonderful light that no other man had yet seen in them, and that none other ever would. The killer started toward her with outstretched arms, but suddenly he fell upon one knee before her, instead, and lifting her hand to his lips kissed it more reverently than he could have kissed the hand of his country's queen. A rumble from Tanta brought the three, all jungle-bred, to instant alertness. Tanta was looking toward the trees behind them, and as their eyes followed his gaze the head and shoulders of a great ape appeared amidst the foliage. For a moment the creature eyed them, and then from its throat rose a loud scream of recognition and of joy, and a moment later the beast had leaped to the ground, followed by a score of bulls like himself, and was waddling toward them, shouting in the primordial tongue of the anthropoid. Tarzan has returned. Tarzan, Lord of the Jungle. It was Akut, and instantly he commenced leaping and bounding about the trio, uttering hideous shrieks and mouthings that to any other human beings might have indicated the most ferocious rage, but these three knew that the king of the apes was doing homage to a king greater than himself. In his wake leaped his shaggy bulls, vying with one another as to which could spring the highest and which utter the most uncanny sounds. Korak laid his hand affectionately upon his father's shoulder. "There is but one Tarzan," he said. "There can never be another." 2 days later the three dropped from the trees on the edge of the plain across which they could see the smoke rising from the bungalow and the cookhouse chimneys. Tarzan of the Apes had regained his civilized clothing from the tree where he had hidden it, and as Korak refused to enter the presence of his mother in the savage half-raiment that he had worn so long, and as Miriam would not leave him, for fear, as she explained, that he would change his mind and run off into the jungle again, the father went on ahead to the bungalow for horses and clothes. My dear met him at the gate, her eyes filled with questioning and sorrow, for she saw that Miriam was not with him. "Where is she?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Muviri told me that she disobeyed your instructions and ran off into the jungle after you had left them." "Oh, John, I cannot bear to lose her, too." And Lady Greystoke broke down and wept, as she pillowed her head upon the broad breast where so often before she had found comfort in the great tragedies of her life. Lord Greystoke raised her head and looked down into her eyes, his own smiling and filled with the light of happiness. "What is it, John?" she cried. "You have good news, do not keep me waiting for it." "I want to be quite sure that you can stand hearing the best news that ever came to either of us," he said. "Joy never kills," she cried. "You have found her." She could not bring herself to hope for the impossible. "Yes, Jane," he said, and his voice was husky with emotion, "I have found her, and him." "Where is he? Where are they?" she demanded. "Out there at the edge of the jungle. He wouldn't come to you in his savage leopard skin and his nakedness, he sent me to fetch him civilized clothing." She clapped her hands in ecstasy, and turned to run toward the bungalow. "Wait," she cried over her shoulder. "I have all his little suits, I have saved them all. I will bring one to you." Tarzan laughed and called to her to stop. "The only clothing on the place that will fit him," he said, "is mine. If it isn't too small for him, your little boy has grown, Jane." She laughed, too. She felt like laughing at everything, or at nothing. The world was all love and happiness and joy once more, the world that had been shrouded in the gloom of her great sorrow for so many years. So great was her joy that for the moment she forgot the sad message that awaited Miriam. She called to Tarzan after he had ridden away to prepare her for it, but he did not hear and rode on without knowing himself what the event was to which his wife referred. And so, an hour later, Korak, the killer, rode home to his mother, the mother whose image had never faded in his boyish heart, and found in her arms and her eyes the love and forgiveness that he pleaded for. And then the mother turned toward Miriam, an expression of pitying sorrow erasing the happiness from her eyes. "My little girl," she said, "in the midst of our happiness a great sorrow awaits you. Mr. Baines did not survive his wound." The expression of sorrow in Miriam's eyes expressed only what she sincerely felt, but it was not the sorrow of a woman bereft of her best beloved. "I am sorry," she said, quite simply. "He would have done me a great wrong, but he amply atoned before he died. Once I thought that I loved him. At first it was only fascination for a type that was new to me, then it was respect for a brave man who had the moral courage to admit a sin and the physical courage to face death to right the wrong he had committed. But it was not love. I did not know what love was until I knew that Korak lived," and she turned toward the killer with a smile. Lady Greystoke looked quickly up into the eyes of her son, the son who one day would be Lord Greystoke. No thought of the difference in the stations of the girl and her boy entered her mind. To her Miriam was fit for a king. She only wanted to know that Jack loved the little Arab waif. The look in his eyes answered the question in her heart, and she threw her arms about them both and kissed them each a dozen times. "Now," she cried, "I shall really have a daughter." It was several weary marches to the nearest mission, but they only waited at the farm a few days for rest and preparation for the great event before setting out upon the journey, and after the marriage ceremony had been performed they kept on to the coast to take passage for England. Those days were the most wonderful of Miriam's life. She had not dreamed even vaguely of the marvels that civilization held in store for her. The great ocean and the commodious steamship filled her with awe. The noise, and bustle and confusion of the English railway station frightened her. If there was a good-sized tree at hand, she confided to Korak, I know that I should run to the very top of it in terror of my life. And make faces and throw twigs at the engine, he laughed back. Poor old Numa, sighed the girl. What will he do without us? Oh, there are others to tease him, my little Mangani, assured Korak. The Greystoke townhouse quite took Miriam's breath away, but when strangers were about none might guess that she had not been to the manor born. They had been home but a week when Lord Greystoke received a message from his friend of many years, Diarnet. It was in the form of a letter of introduction brought by one General Armand Jacquet. Lord Greystoke recalled the name, as who familiar with modern French history would not, for Jacquet was in reality the Prince de Cardronet, that intense republican who refused to use, even by courtesy, a title that had belonged to his family for 400 years. There is no place for princes in a republic, he was wont to say. Lord Greystoke received the hawk-nosed, grey-moustached soldier in his library, and after a dozen words the two men had formed a mutual esteem that was to endure through life. I have come to you, explained General Jacquet, because our dear Admiral tells me that there is no one in all the world who is more intimately acquainted with Central Africa than you. Let me tell you my story from the beginning. Many years ago my little daughter was stolen, presumably by Arabs, while I was serving with the Foreign Legion in Algeria. We did all that love and money and even government resources could do to discover her, but all to no avail. Her picture was published in the leading papers of every large city in the world, yet never did we find a man or woman who ever had seen her since the day she mysteriously disappeared. A week since there came to me in Paris a swarthy Arab, who called himself Abdul Kamak. He said that he had found my daughter and could lead me to her. I took him at once to Admiral Diarnet, whom I knew had travelled some in Central Africa. The man's story led the Admiral to believe that the place where the white girl the Arab supposed to be my daughter was held in captivity was not far from your African estates, and he advised that I come at once and call upon you, that you would know if such a girl were in your neighbourhood. What proof did the Arab bring that she was your daughter? Asked Lord Greystoke. None, replied the other. That is why we thought best to consult you before organising an expedition. The fellow had only an old photograph of her on the back of which was pasted a newspaper cutting describing her and offering a reward. We feared that having found this somewhere it had aroused his cupidity and led him to believe that in some way he could obtain the reward, possibly by foisting upon us a white girl on the chance that so many years had elapsed that we would not be able to recognize an impostor as such. Have you the photograph with you? Asked Lord Greystoke. The general drew an envelope from his pocket, took a yellowed photograph from it and handed it to the Englishman. Tears dimmed the old warrior's eyes as they fell again upon the pictured features of his lost daughter. Lord Greystoke examined the photograph for a moment. A queer expression entered his eyes. He touched a bell at his elbow, and an instant later a footman entered. Ask my son's wife if she will be so good as to come to the library, he directed. The two men sat in silence. General Jacquet was too well bred to show in any way the chagrin and disappointment he felt in the summary manner in which Lord Greystoke had dismissed the subject of his call. As soon as the young lady had come and he had been presented he would make his departure. A moment later Miriam entered. Lord Greystoke and General Jacquet rose and faced her. The Englishman spoke no word of introduction. He wanted to mark the effect of the first sight of the girl's face on the Frenchman, for he had a theory, a heaven-born theory that had leaped into his mind the moment his eyes had rested on the baby face of Jean Jacquet. General Jacquet took one look at Miriam, then he turned toward Lord Greystoke. "How long have you known it?" he asked, a trifle accusingly. "Since you showed me that photograph a moment ago," replied the Englishman. "It is she," said Jacquet, shaking with suppressed emotion, "but she does not recognize me. Of course she could not." Then he turned to Miriam. "My child," he said, "I am your—" But she interrupted him with a quick, glad cry, as she ran toward him with outstretched arms. "I know you. I know you," she cried. "Oh, now I remember," and the old man folded her in his arms. Jack Clayton and his mother were summoned, and when the story had been told them they were only glad that little Miriam had found a father and a mother. "And really you didn't marry an Arab waif after all," said Miriam. "Isn't it fine?" "You are fine," replied the killer. "I married my little Miriam, and I don't care, for my part, whether she is an Arab, or just a little Tarmangani." "She is neither, my son," said General Armand Jacquet. "She is a princess in her own right." The end.